Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. I'd been slumped in my squeaky office chair, counting the minutes until the midday heat lost its grip on our remote desert outpost. The thermometer outside read 112 degrees, and the ancient air conditioning unit rattled and wheezed like it might give up at any moment. 3 years into my position as a senior park ranger at Juniper Desert National Reserve, and I still hadn't fully acclimated to the punishing summer temperatures. The radio on my desk crackled to life, startling me from my heat-induced stupor. One of our volunteers' voices trembled on the other end, asking for immediate backup. They'd spotted smoke rising from somewhere near the far boundary of our park. Normally, suspicious plumes of smoke meant yet another abandoned vehicle set ablaze, something we encountered often enough that it barely rattled me anymore. Drug runners and car thieves frequently used our 300,000-acre expanse of protected land as a dumping ground. But the quiver in the volunteer's tone gnawed at me. Something about this situation felt fundamentally wrong. Without waiting for protocol or double-checking any sign-out sheets, I grabbed my keys and waved my coworker Manny over. A stocky veteran ranger with 20 years of service etched into the creases around his eyes. Manny didn't ask questions. He simply followed. We piled into our dusty Park Service truck and took off down the barren road, nothing but a shimmer of heat distorting the horizon. My mind kept replaying worst-case scenarios. A wildfire blazing out of control, hikers trapped in a gutted vehicle, or something darker I couldn't fully process yet. The desert seemed unnaturally quiet as we sped toward the site. Normally I'd catch glimpses of desert hares scuttling across the road or a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. Not this time. The entire landscape felt as if it was holding back, bracing for bad news. Manny fiddled with the radio, trying to reach the volunteers again, but all we got was static laced with muffled crackles. Each burst of noise made me grip the steering wheel tighter. "Could be the mountains blocking the signal," Manny offered, though his furrowed brow suggested he didn't believe his own explanation. I nodded, focusing on the dirt road ahead. How far out did they say they were? Boundary marker 17. That's nearly 30 miles from the visitor center. That particular section of the park had become increasingly problematic over the past year. Its proximity to an unpatrolled stretch of highway made it attractive to those looking to dispose of evidence or engage in illicit activities. We'd found everything from stolen vehicles to drug paraphernalia to illegal hunting camps, but something in my gut told me this call would be different. As we approached marker 16, the truck's radio suddenly burst back to life. The volunteer's voice came through in broken fragments. Human remains. Vehicle completely. Need assistance. Manny and I exchanged alarmed glances. This wasn't just another burned-out car. This was something far worse. We rounded a bend and spotted thick smoke curling into the cloudless sky. The acrid scent of burned rubber, melted plastic, and scorched metal tore through the truck's ventilation system. We pulled up, tires crunching on gravel, and the two volunteers waved us over frantically, their faces drained of color. I stepped out and immediately felt heat so intense it seemed to singe my eyebrows. The car in question was more of a scorched metal skeleton at this point, the flames mostly dying down but leaving behind angry black fumes that stained the pristine desert air. It was a sedan, or had been before the fire consumed most of its identifiable features. Manny and I exchanged uneasy glances. We'd dealt with torched vehicles before. Thieves often dumped them after stripping out valuable parts. But as we edged closer, something caught my eye through the shattered driver's side window. It looked like a large mass leaning against the steering wheel. I tried convincing myself it was just melted upholstery. Stepping around for a clearer look, I discovered it was definitely not just a ruined seat. My stomach dropped as I found myself staring at the remains of a person. The body blackened and distorted beyond recognition. The door handle had melted in places, and a length of rope had fused to the metal. This wasn't a simple joyride gone wrong. Someone had brought this car here, bound the person inside, and set the entire thing ablaze. The sight pressed down on me like a physical weight, suffocating me with its grotesque reality. Manny rushed back to the truck to call for proper backup, police, forensics, the coroner. As we stood by, the smoke continued coiling in the sky, trailing a pungent odor that clung to my clothes and seemed to seep into my skin. Time seemed to grind to a halt while we waited. One of the volunteers hovered near me, stammering about how they'd initially assumed the car was just another stolen husk until they peered into the driver's seat. I scanned the area, suddenly paranoid about a possible suspect lurking in the brush, perhaps watching us from behind a cluster of sagebrush or creosote. The vast openness of the desert, which I'd always found comforting, now felt exposing and vulnerable. "How long have you been here?" I asked the volunteers, not taking my eyes off the surrounding terrain. "About 40 minutes, the younger one replied, his voice cracking. "We were doing the boundary check when we saw the smoke. Thought it might be hikers in trouble or the start of a wildfire." "Did you see anyone else? Any vehicles leaving the area?" They both shook their heads. "Just dust and heat," the older volunteer said. "And then this." I nodded, pulling out my notebook to document the scene while we waited for authorities. The victim appeared to be of average build, though the fire had made details nearly impossible to discern. What struck me most was the rope, clearly visible where it had melted into the door frame. This hadn't been an accident or suicide. Someone had wanted this person to suffer, to burn alive while conscious and aware. The thought made my skin crawl. The fire department roared in 30 minutes later, dousing the smoldering wreck and sending up fresh plumes of steam that hissed against the charred metal. Then the police arrived, setting up a perimeter with yellow crime scene tape that fluttered mockingly in the hot desert breeze. I tried to focus on small details as the scene transformed into a bustling investigation. Half-burned food wrappers on the ground, a single shoe nearly 50 feet from the vehicle, and what appeared to be bullet holes scarring the car's frame. How many shots were fired? Was the victim alive when they were bound? I hated how my own thoughts drifted into such morbid territory, but I needed to gather facts if I ever wanted to sleep again. Detective Rivera from the county sheriff's department approached me after speaking with the forensic team. I'd worked with her on previous cases, mostly illegal hunting operations and drug busts. Her normally composed demeanor seemed shaken. "This wasn't random," she said quietly, nodding toward the vehicle. "The victim was shot 3 times before the fire was set." "Small mercy, I suppose," I replied, immediately regretting the callousness of my words. "Maybe." She hesitated. "But the preliminary examination suggests the shots weren't immediately fatal. The victim was still alive when the fire started." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Someone had intentionally left this person to burn to death after ensuring they couldn't escape. The cruelty of it was staggering. "Any ID on the victim yet?" I asked, swallowing hard against the dryness in my throat. "Nothing definitive. The heat destroyed most identifying features and any documentation that might have been present. We're checking missing persons reports and dental records, but it could take days." Hours slipped by as investigators combed through the ashes, taking pictures, bagging evidence, and mapping the scene. I noticed Manny in a corner, staring silently at the wreck. He told me once that he was used to gore from his time in the military, but even he looked shaken. "What we found here wasn't just violence. It was calculated malice." "You've been out here a while," Detective Rivera said, returning to where I stood. "Noticed anything unusual in the past few weeks? Strangers, suspicious vehicles, anything out of the ordinary?" I thought about it. "We had a group of hikers report seeing someone in a black pickup truck last weekend parked in a no-vehicle zone. By the time our patrol got there, they were gone. And there's been an increase in unauthorized camping along the eastern ridge." "Black pickup," she repeated, making a note. "Model, license plate?" "No details, unfortunately. The hikers just mentioned the color." She nodded, clearly disappointed. "Well, keep your eyes open. Whoever did this knows the park layout. They chose this spot specifically because it's remote but still accessible by vehicle." The implication wasn't lost on me. Our killer could be someone familiar with the area, perhaps even a regular visitor. The thought sent a chill through me, despite the desert heat. Eventually, the site was labeled secure, and the authorities sent us on our way. A few sheriff's deputies remained to maintain the perimeter until forensics could finish their work. As Manny and I drove back to headquarters, the sky had bled into a deep, sun-scorched orange. My head swam with everything we'd witnessed. The volunteers, Wide-eyed and jittery, followed in their own vehicle, still reeling from the realization that the scene they'd stumbled upon was so much worse than they'd initially feared. By the time we reached the station, rumors were already circulating about the haunted site where the burned car had been discovered. Word travels fast in small circles, and folks around here couldn't resist a good ghost story. I overheard someone joking about how it had probably become the park's most sought-after camping spot for thrill seekers. Visitors love a grim legend, but there was nothing amusing in the images still stuck in my head. The scorched seat, the twisted rope, that unrecognizable form in the driver's seat. I tried distracting myself with trivial tasks, sorting gear, scribbling meaningless notes on my next shift's to-do list. Nothing helped. Deep down, I knew I wouldn't forget what I saw that day. The desert had always been harsh, but I'd never thought it could be so merciless. And we still had no clue who that poor person was, or why they ended up on that lonely stretch of sand. That night, rest was impossible. All I could do was stare at the ceiling of my small ranger cabin, replaying the stench of scorched metal and flesh, the hush of onlookers too rattled to speak. My mind refused to drift anywhere else. Instead, it clung to the notion that something, or someone, was out there, ready to do it again if they felt like it. For the first time since I started this job, the wide-open desert didn't look like a place of freedom. It felt like a vast graveyard where you bury your secrets, the kind that should never see daylight. 3 days after discovering the burned vehicle, I was back on duty, though the images from that scene continued to haunt my waking hours. The forensic team had removed the victim's remains, but yellow tape still cordoned off the area. Desert scavengers, coyotes, vultures, and ravens circled the site, drawn by the lingering smell of death despite the fire's destructive force. Detective Rivera called that morning with an update. They'd identified the victim through dental records as a 34-year-old man who'd been reported missing from a town about 80 miles away. His name was Samuel Winters, a construction worker with no criminal record or obvious enemies. The case was becoming more puzzling, not less. "Any leads on the perpetrator?" I asked, hoping for something concrete to ease my growing unease. "Nothing solid yet," Rivera admitted. "But we found something strange. The bullet casings recovered from the scene matched those from another murder 6 months ago, a body found in an abandoned mine shaft about 40 miles from your park." My pulse quickened. "You think we're dealing with a serial killer?" "I didn't say that," she cautioned. "But the similarities are concerning. Both victims were bound, shot multiple times, and left in remote locations. We're reopening the previous case files." After hanging up, I sat at my desk, staring at the wall map of Juniper Desert National Reserve. Red pins marked locations of various incidents over the past year, mostly minor infractions like illegal camping or unauthorized off-road driving. But now I saw these innocent markers differently, as potential puzzle pieces in a larger, more sinister pattern. I was still reeling from this new information when we got another call that sent the station into near panic. Our supervisor, usually the picture of calm, was on the phone, voice tight with tension. A man on the line had threatened to end his life, claimed he had a stash of guns. He'd spat out coordinates that placed him right on the fringe of our territory, in a remote area known for its dramatic sandstone formations. I remember standing in the office, radio in hand, waiting to be dispatched, my mind already leaping to dreadful scenarios. Was I about to come across another scene as horrific as that burned-out husk? The station chief tried to keep the man on the line, but he was raving about regret, about how he had nowhere else to go, that he wanted the desert to swallow him up. My coworker Alonzo and I exchanged glances. We both knew we were going out there. Protocol demanded it, no matter how unqualified we felt for a crisis involving a potentially armed individual. We piled into the same dusty truck I'd driven to the charred vehicle days earlier. The sun was glaring overhead and everything in the desert looked bleached, barren. Alonzo fiddled with the radio, trying to get more updates, but the chatter was fragmented. We heard that another ranger outfit from the adjacent state park had arrived first, so we sped up, hoping they'd manage to talk the man down. A pit in my stomach warned me the outcome might be far from ideal. As we approached the coordinates, we spotted a couple of trucks from the other agency parked at a crooked angle. One of their rangers stood by, raising a hand in a universal signal that basically said, "Keep your distance." We eased off the gas and rolled to a stop. I could feel a wave of dread pulsing from the group in front of us. I hopped out, scanning the desert for any sign of movement. The other agency's ranger, a woman who looked like she'd barely slept in days, walked over. Her expression was a mask of grief, as though she'd lived through this nightmare before. "You're too late," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the desert wind. He followed through with his threat, but he didn't die instantly. Shot himself, then staggered about 50 yards, leaving behind a trail of blood until he finally collapsed. That knowledge hit me like a weight on my chest. While Alonzo stayed back with the truck, I inched forward to where the sand turned darker. Another ranger was kneeling there, shaking his head, radio in hand. I couldn't see the man's body directly. It was behind some rocks, but the hush from everyone present told me I didn't want to. It made me think of the new ranger standing off to the side, hugging her own arms. Word around the station was that she'd lost her husband, a fellow ranger, to suicide not long ago. And here she was, face to face with another self-inflicted tragedy. The parallels must have cut her deeper than words could describe. Alonzo came up behind me, asked if we should offer help, do anything at all. The other outfit's lead ranger shook her head. She said they had it under control, though her tired eyes suggested otherwise. They told us to leave so we wouldn't be buried in endless paperwork. Officially, it was a matter for local law enforcement to finalize. We lingered, unsure of our place. Ultimately, we retreated back to our truck, guilt and sadness trailing behind us. Driving away felt surreal. The interior of the truck was baking from the sun, but I was shivering inside, grappling with the idea that these desert parks I once loved had turned into a stage for human despair. The further we got from that scene, the more the day's bright sky turned into a punishing glare, as if the desert itself was tired of witnessing such sorrow. Back at the station, the combination of the burned car murder and the suicide weighed heavily on everyone's mood. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the grimness. I heard hushed conversations in the hall, people whispering about how the desert had always attracted wanderers with troubled souls, how some folks came here for spiritual rebirth, while others sought an escape from their demons. That evening, I found myself in the records room digging through old incident reports. Something about Detective Rivera's comment regarding the previous murder had triggered my investigative instincts. 6 months ago, a body in an abandoned mine shaft 40 miles away. What else had happened during that period that might connect to our current situation? The files were disorganized, yellowing papers stuffed into manila folders with fading labels. Many predated digital record keeping, meaning they'd never been properly cataloged. I spent hours sifting through reports of missing hikers, most found alive, illegal hunting, drug trafficking, and vandalism. Just as I was about to give up, a thin folder labeled Unidentified Remains, March 2023, caught my attention. Inside was a sparse report about partial human remains discovered by a geology student in a remote canyon about 25 miles from where we'd found the burned car. The remains had been there for months, possibly years, and the case had apparently stalled due to lack of evidence. What struck me was a detail in the accompanying photographs, remnants of rope fibers found near the skeletal fragments. The report noted that the victim's wrists showed signs of being bound. The similarities to our current case sent a wave of unease through me. I was making copies of the file when Manny walked in, looking concerned. "You should go home," he said. "You've been here 14 hours straight." I gestured to the papers. "Look at this. March last year, remains found with rope markings." And Rivera mentioned another body from 6 months ago with the same bullet casings as our burned car victim. That's 3 potentially connected murders in our area. Manny frowned, taking the report from my hands. "You think we have a serial killer using the park as a dumping ground? Or worse, someone who works here, who knows the terrain," I said, giving voice to the fear that had been growing in me. "The locations are all different, but share certain characteristics. Remote but accessible by vehicle. Minimal chance of witnesses, natural features that would help conceal evidence." Manny's face darkened. "That's a serious accusation. You can't just..." "I'm not accusing anyone specific," I clarified, "but I think these cases might be connected, and I think the killer has intimate knowledge of this area." Unable to take the tension at the station any longer, I decided to do something that in retrospect seems incredibly foolish. After my shift ended, I drove out to one of our closed seasonal parks for some midnight stargazing. I figured maybe solitude and a sky full of stars could help me remember the desert's beauty, give me a reason to breathe easier. And for some odd reason, I packed my banjo. I'm no musician, but strumming a few off-key chords had a calming effect I desperately needed. Under the cover of darkness, I navigated the winding roads leading to a park that had been closed to the public for the off-season. 30 miles of emptiness stretched behind me. Not a single car light in sight. I pulled up to a rusted picnic table near the border of a dried-up wash, the overhead firmament ablaze with more stars than I'd seen in years. I climbed onto the table, banjo resting awkwardly in my lap. Each chord I played sounded tinny in the open space, and a breeze carried the notes away, scattering them across the desert. At first, I found a small measure of peace in that rhythm. Plunk, plunk, squeak, a laugh at my own poor skills. Then my imagination flared. Images of charred rope, bullet holes, and that empty-eyed ranger discovering another unspeakable scene. Doubts crowded my head. This place suddenly felt like a proving ground for every dark possibility. I glanced at the horizon, wondering if a stranger with bad intentions lurked out there, hidden in the shadows. Why had I chosen to be alone again? Where night could hide anything or anyone. A noise shattered my thoughts. Quick, muffled sounds in the brush, accompanied by what almost resembled whispers. My chest tightened and I paused, banjo strings still vibrating from the last chord. Something or someone was moving in the darkness, not even trying to be subtle. My eyes struggled to focus, scanning the shrubs for a shape, human, animal, or worse. Those high-pitched murmurs drew nearer, punctuated by rustling leaves. I braced for some twisted confrontation. Maybe it was a group of drifters or local troublemakers who'd come upon me by chance. My pulse hammered, and every nerve wanted me to dash back to the truck. Suddenly, 3 coyotes burst from the undergrowth. They yipped and scampered like they owned the place, giving me barely a passing glance as they streaked by. My heart nearly jumped out of my throat in that moment, a bizarre mix of shock and relief. When their dark silhouettes merged with the distant night, I stood there blinking, banjo clutched in a trembling grip. I couldn't help chuckling at my own paranoia, but a heavier realization sank in. These desert creatures roamed confidently, oblivious to my presence and the nightmares people bring. They weren't weighed down by haunted campsites or heartbreak in the sand. This place was theirs, and I was just an interloper. I put the banjo away, the final notes of my attempt at stargazing fading into memory. Driving back, I kept hearing those coyotes in my head, their wild, carefree calls echoing across the dunes, a stark contrast to the human tragedies we'd witnessed. Looking at the vacant road ahead, illuminated by my weak headlights, the desert didn't seem lifeless anymore. It was alive in a raw, indifferent way, capable of hosting scenes of cruelty, sadness, and awe. But the fear clung to me nonetheless, reminding me that while the coyotes found freedom out here, I was the one haunted by what we'd seen. No matter how many shooting stars lit the sky or how many chords I strummed, I couldn't outrun that uneasy feeling that more trouble could be lurking just beyond the next stretch of desert. 2 weeks after the burned car incident, I was conducting a routine patrol along the western boundary when my radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end belonged to Suki, one of our seasonal rangers who primarily handled visitor interactions. "Base to Unit 7, she said, her normally cheerful tone noticeably strained. "We've got a situation at Lookout Point. Hikers reported finding something concerning." "What kind of concerning?" I asked, already turning my vehicle around. A pause. "They say there are photographs nailed to a Joshua tree." Photographs of park rangers. Our rangers. My stomach tightened. "I'm 15 minutes out. Tell them not to touch anything." I pushed the old truck as fast as it would go, dust billowing behind me. Lookout Point was a popular spot for tourists seeking panoramic desert views, but it was a Tuesday in the off-season. There shouldn't have been many visitors. When I arrived, a middle-aged couple stood near their rental car, looking visibly shaken. They pointed wordlessly toward a gnarled Joshua tree standing about 50 yards from the main viewing area. As I approached, what I saw made my blood freeze. Dozens of photographs had been nailed directly into the trunk and branches of the ancient tree, creating a macabre display that rustled in the desert breeze. Most disturbing were the images themselves, surveillance-style photos of park staff going about their duties. Manny checking permits at a trailhead. Suki leading a nature walk, our supervisor unlocking the visitor center at dawn, and there I was, captured through a telephoto lens as I fueled up my truck at the park depot. Someone had drawn a crude red X across my face. I carefully removed one of the photos, a shot of Alonzo on patrol, trying to touch only the edges. The image had been taken from a distance, suggesting the photographer had used professional equipment with powerful zoom capabilities. On the back, written in neat block letters, were the words, "Watching you all." After securing the scene and calling for backup, I interviewed the hikers who'd made the discovery. They were tourists from Minnesota who had stopped at Lookout Point on their way to the Grand Canyon. They'd seen nothing suspicious before finding the photos, though they mentioned a black pickup truck parked near the entrance when they arrived. It was gone by the time they returned to their car, a black pickup, the same vehicle mentioned by hikers weeks ago before we found the burned car. When Detective Rivera arrived with her forensic team, she took one look at the display and ordered an immediate sweep of the area. "This isn't a threat," she said gravely. "It's a promise. Whoever did this is escalating." The forensic team worked methodically, documenting and collecting each photograph. 57 in total, featuring every full-time and seasonal employee at our park. The pictures appeared to have been taken over several months, suggesting long-term surveillance. Most disturbing was the realization that many had been taken in locations where staff shouldn't have been visible from public areas, suggesting the photographer had intimate knowledge of the park's layout or had been trespassing in restricted zones. "We need to consider the possibility that this is connected to the homicides," Rivera said as we watched her team work. "The level of planning, the specific targeting of park personnel, it feels personal." "You think one of the victims might have been connected to the park?" I asked. "Or the killer is," she replied, her eyes meeting mine. "Either way, everyone on your staff needs to be extremely cautious. Travel in pairs, vary your routines, report anything unusual immediately." That evening, the station held an emergency meeting. Our supervisor, a normally unflappable man in his 60s with 3 decades of park service experience, looked genuinely frightened as he briefed the staff about the situation. "Until further notice, no one patrols alone," he announced. "We're installing additional security cameras at all facilities, and the Sheriff's Department will be increasing their presence in the area. Detective Rivera has requested personnel files for everyone who's worked here in the past 5 years. Standard procedure in this type of investigation." A tense murmur ran through the room. The implication was clear. The killer could be one of us, or someone who had previously worked alongside us. "What about the photographs?" Suki asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do they have any leads on who took them?" Our supervisor hesitated. "The technical analysis suggests they were taken with a high-end camera with a telephoto lens. The printing was done at a commercial facility, but with cash payment and no security footage available. No fingerprints on the photos or nails except for the hikers who found them." After the meeting, Manny pulled me aside. "You've been digging into old case files," he said. "Found anything else that might connect to this?" I shook my head. "Nothing concrete, but I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something obvious. The killer knows this park, knows our routines. This field, targeted. You think it's personal? Against the Park Service? Or against someone specific?" I replied, the red X across my photo flashing in my mind. That night, I double-checked every lock in my small ranger cabin, drawing the curtains tight and positioning a chair under the doorknob. Outside, the desert wind howled against the windows, sounding almost like distant laughter. I pulled my service weapon from its lockbox and placed it on the nightstand beside my bed. As exhausted as I was, I couldn't close my eyes without seeing those photographs fluttering on the Joshua tree. Someone had been watching us, studying our movements, learning our patterns, and now they were making sure we knew it. What I couldn't figure out was why. What did a park ranger have to do with murdered civilians? What connection was I missing? As I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, one thought kept circling. In the vast emptiness of the desert, you're never truly alone. There are always eyes watching from somewhere, whether animal, human, or something darker lurking in the shadows of your own mind. The day after the photo discovery, the park was closed to the public pending the investigation. Rangers were assigned to turn away visitors at entrance points while forensic teams continued their work. I was stationed at the eastern gate, a remote entrance rarely used except by hardcore hikers accessing the backcountry trails. The morning passed uneventfully, just a handful of disappointed tourists to redirect. Around noon, a dust cloud on the horizon signaled an approaching vehicle. I straightened up, preparing my explanation about the temporary closure. The vehicle that pulled up wasn't the typical tourist SUV or camper van. It was a black pickup truck, mud deliberately splashed over the license plate. My heart rate instantly accelerated as I recalled the descriptions from previous incidents. The driver kept the engine running, face obscured by dark sunglasses and a low-pulled baseball cap. Something about their posture, rigid, alert, hands gripping the steering wheel at precisely 10 and 2, struck me as military or law enforcement trained. "Park's closed today," I said, approaching cautiously, hand resting near my sidearm. "Environmental assessment work. Should reopen tomorrow." The driver remained silent, head turning slightly as though surveying the area behind me. Then, without warning, they threw the truck into reverse, executed a perfect three-point turn and sped away, leaving me in a cloud of dust. I immediately radioed the incident, providing what details I could about the vehicle. It matched the description from previous sightings: black pickup, newer model, mud-concealing identifying features. Within minutes, county sheriff's deputies were dispatched to search the surrounding roads, but the truck had vanished. When my shift ended, I drove directly to the sheriff's department to meet with Detective Rivera. I found her in a conference room that had been transformed into an incident command center. Maps of the park covered one wall, with red pins marking the locations of the burned car, the photo display, and previous suspicious sightings. Another wall featured photographs of the 3 confirmed victims: Samuel Winters from the burned car and 2 others from the cases I'd discovered in the records. "The black pickup showed up at my gate today," I told her without preamble. Mud over the plates, driver concealed their face. They left when I approached. Rivera looked up sharply from the file she'd been reviewing. Description of the driver: medium build, baseball cap, sunglasses. Couldn't tell gender or age, but they handled the vehicle like someone with tactical driving training. She nodded, adding a yellow pin to the map at the location of the eastern gate. "That's the 4th sighting of a vehicle matching that description in the past month. Always near locations connected to our cases." I studied the map, noting the pattern forming. "They're circling the perimeter. Testing our security, maybe? Or surveilling potential targets," Rivera said grimly. "We've analyzed the 3 confirmed victims and found one connection. They all visited Juniper Desert National Reserve within 2 months of their deaths." This revelation sent a chill through me. "Visitors, not staff?" "Correct. Samuel Winters was here on a camping trip 6 weeks before his murder. The mineshaft victim had a parking permit for your Northwest trailhead found in his wallet." "And the remains from the canyon case?" "She was wearing a Juniper Desert souvenir bracelet when she was killed." I sank into a chair, mind racing. "So the killer is targeting visitors to our park. But why? Random selection? Or something specific about these individuals?" Rivera pushed a folder toward me. "This is where it gets complicated. All 3 victims had criminal records, minor offenses, but still. Winters had a domestic violence charge that was later dropped. The mineshaft victim had 2 DUIs. The canyon victim had been arrested for check fraud." "You think the killer is some kind of vigilante? Targeting people with criminal backgrounds?" "Possibly. Or these individuals witnessed something they shouldn't have while visiting the park, something that made them targets." I thought about the photographs nailed to the Joshua tree, the red X across my face. "But why target park staff then?" "We haven't done anything wrong." Rivera's expression darkened. "Maybe in the killer's mind you have, by not preventing whatever they're punishing people for." As I drove back to my cabin that evening, the desert landscape seemed transformed. Every shadow potentially concealed a watcher. Every vehicle on the road could be the black pickup. The vast openness that had once represented freedom now felt like exposure. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. At home, I spread my own copies of the case files across my kitchen table, searching for connections I might have missed. The victims shared no obvious characteristics beyond their criminal records and visits to the park. Different ages, genders, occupations, hometowns. The only pattern was the killer's methodology: binding the victims, inflicting suffering before death, disposing of the bodies in remote locations within the desert. Around midnight, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Manny's number. "You need to come to the visitor center," he said without greeting, his voice tight with tension. "Someone broke in. Left something for you specifically." 20 minutes later, I stood in the darkened visitor center, staring at what had been left on the information desk. A single photograph, me, asleep in my bed, taken through my bedroom window the previous night. On the back, the same neat block lettering, "You're next." The discovery of the photograph taken through my bedroom window changed everything. Detective Rivera immediately arranged for me to be relocated to a safe house in the nearest town, 30 miles from the park. I was placed on administrative leave, partly for my protection, partly because I was now considered a specific target in an active investigation. The safe house was a small ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood, with unmarked police vehicles parked discreetly on the street. 2 deputies were assigned as protection, working in shifts to ensure 24-hour coverage. My service weapon remained with me, a constant weight on my hip. 3 days into this protective custody, Rivera arrived with a proposition. "We need to draw them out," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "Our surveillance of the park isn't yielding results. Whoever this is knows the terrain too well, avoids our patrols, stays off the main roads." "You want to use me as bait," I stated flatly. It wasn't a question. She didn't deny it. "You're already their target. The photograph makes that clear. But we can control the circumstances of your exposure, set a trap on our terms." "Why me specifically?" "What makes me different from the other Rangers?" Rivera hesitated, then pushed a file folder across the table. "We've been reviewing case histories. 3 years ago, you were the lead ranger on an incident involving a family of hikers who got lost in the northern sector. The father died of heat stroke before your team located them. I remembered the case all too well, a family of 4 who had ventured off trail without adequate water or supplies. By the time another hiker reported them missing and we mounted a search, the father had already succumbed to the elements. We found the mother and 2 children huddled beside his body, severely dehydrated, but alive." "What does that have to do with our current situation?" I asked. "The deceased was Joseph Mercer, an accountant from Sacramento. His son, William Mercer, was 17 at the time. After the incident, William joined the military, received training as a sniper, and was later discharged following a psychological evaluation that deemed him unfit for service due to obsessive tendencies and inability to process grief in a healthy manner." She pulled out a photograph, a military ID showing a young man with intense eyes and a rigid posture. "William Mercer owns a black pickup truck registered in Nevada. He withdrew his entire savings 3 months ago and hasn't used a credit card or cell phone since. His last known address was abandoned, neighbors reporting he spoke frequently about returning to the desert to make things right." The pieces clicked into place with terrible clarity. He blames the Park Service for his father's death. He's punishing visitors who break rules, the same kind of infractions his family committed, and targeting rangers who he believes failed to protect his father. "That's our working theory," Rivera confirmed. "The 3 known victims all committed minor infractions in the park: off-trail hiking, unpermitted camping, unauthorized vehicle access. The same mistakes his family made. And I was the ranger who found them too late," I said quietly. "In his mind, I failed to save his father." "Exactly. Which is why you're uniquely positioned to help us catch him. He wants you specifically. We can use that." The plan they developed was simple but dangerous. I would return to duty, patrolling a specific isolated section of the park where surveillance teams could maintain visual contact at all times. My movements would be predictable enough to tempt William Mercer, but I would never be truly alone or unprotected. Special tactical units would be positioned to intercept him when he made his move. I agreed to the plan, not out of bravery, but from a deep-seated need for resolution. The desert had become a place of menace rather than wonder, and I couldn't imagine continuing my career there with this threat looming. Better to confront it directly, with support, than to spend years looking over my shoulder. 3 days later, I was back in my ranger uniform, driving my familiar Park Service truck along a predetermined route. My vehicle had been equipped with hidden tracking devices and a panic button that would summon immediate backup. A bulletproof vest felt stiff and unnatural beneath my uniform shirt. The radio remained silent as I patrolled, though I knew multiple teams were monitoring my progress. I drove slowly, stopping occasionally at scenic viewpoints, making myself visible. Each exposed moment sent a shiver of vulnerability through me, knowing I was deliberately making myself a target. Hours passed without incident. The desert sun began its descent, painting the landscape in deepening shades of orange and purple. As twilight approached, Rivera's voice came through my radio. "Time to head back. We'll try again tomorrow." I acknowledged the instruction and turned my vehicle toward headquarters. That's when I noticed the dust cloud on a distant ridge, a vehicle moving parallel to mine on an unmaintained service road. "Possible contact," I reported calmly, though my heart was hammering in my chest. "Vehicle on the Western Ridge Road, moving south." "Maintain course," Rivera instructed. "Teams are tracking." I continued driving, resisting the urge to speed up or look directly at the parallel vehicle. Through my peripheral vision, I could see it was keeping pace with me, gradually descending toward the main road where it would intersect with my path about a mile ahead. "He's moving to intercept," I reported. "Black pickup, single occupant." "Understood. Tactical teams are repositioning. Keep driving normally. Do not engage." The intersection approached, a simple four-way junction where the service road met the main park drive. I maintained my speed, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The black pickup reached the junction moments before I did, skidding to a stop directly in my path. I had no choice but to brake hard, stopping 30 yards from the blocking vehicle. Through the windshield I could see the driver, a young man with military short hair and intense eyes. William Mercer. He stepped out of his truck and my breath caught in my throat. In his hands was a high-powered rifle with a scope, already aimed in my direction. "Rangers, suspect is armed," I said into the radio, keeping my voice level. "Rifle with scope. I am pinned in vehicle." "Hold position," Rivera responded urgently. "Teams are 60 seconds out." William Mercer began walking toward my truck, rifle trained steadily on me. His face showed no emotion, just a cold determination that was more terrifying than rage would have been. I had seconds to make a decision. Stay in the vehicle and risk being shot through the windshield, or step out and try to establish communication, buying time for the tactical teams to arrive. Taking a deep breath, I opened my door slowly, keeping my hands visible. "William," I called out, using his name deliberately. "I know who you are. I know about your father." He paused momentarily, surprise flickering across his features. Then his expression hardened again. "You let him die," he said, voice carrying clearly across the distance between us. "You could have saved him. Could have saved all of them if you'd done your job properly." "I know," I replied, stepping fully out of the vehicle but keeping it between us. "Not a day goes by that I don't think about your family. Wish I'd found you sooner." This seemed to catch him off guard. The rifle barrel dipped slightly. "You remember?" "Of course I remember. Joseph Mercer, age 45, your mother Catherine, you and your sister Abigail. July 17th, 3 years ago, Northern Canyon Trail." His eyes widened at the precise details. "You know their names." "I know all their names," I said truthfully. "Everyone we've lost in this park. Every person we couldn't save in time, including your father." For a moment, William seemed to waver, the rifle lowering further. Then his expression hardened once more. "Remembering isn't enough," he growled. "People keep making the same mistakes. Hikers ignore warnings. Campers break rules. And rangers like you let them die. Is that why you killed those visitors? Because they broke park rules?" His face twisted. "They deserved it. Just like the others deserved it. Just like you deserve it." In the distance, I could hear the faint sound of approaching vehicles, the tactical teams closing in. I needed to keep him talking just a little longer. "What about the rangers you've been watching? The photographs? What did they do to deserve your punishment?" "Failed," he spat. "All of you failed. You're supposed to protect people from the desert, from themselves. Instead, you let them wander off and die." I took a careful step to the side, trying to position myself better. "Your father made a choice, William. He chose to go off trail. He chose not to carry enough water." "Shut up!" he shouted, raising the rifle again. "Don't you dare blame him. He was just trying to show us something beautiful. A hidden canyon. Something special for our family." "I'm not blaming him," I said quickly. "I'm saying the desert is unforgiving. It doesn't care about intentions. Your father wanted to create a special memory for you. But the desert doesn't make exceptions for good people with good intentions. William's hands trembled slightly on the rifle. He shouldn't have died. No, he shouldn't have. And I wish every day that we'd found you sooner. But killing innocent people won't bring him back. They weren't innocent, he insisted. They were all breaking rules, just like my father. They needed to be examples. The sound of vehicles was now unmistakable. William glanced nervously over his shoulder, seeing dust clouds approaching from multiple directions. "William," I said firmly, "put the rifle down. This ends now, one way or another. But it doesn't have to end with more death." His eyes met mine, and I saw the broken young man beneath the killer's facade. A boy who had watched his father die in the merciless desert heat, who had never properly processed that trauma, who had twisted his grief into a mission of vengeance. For a long moment, we stood in silent confrontation, the desert wind whipping dust around us. Then, slowly, William lowered his rifle. "He would have been so disappointed in me," he whispered, tears suddenly streaming down his face. "What have I done?" As tactical teams surrounded us, weapons drawn, William Mercer sank to his knees in the desert dust, the rifle falling from his hands. The nightmare that had haunted Juniper Desert National Reserve was over. 6 months after William Mercer's arrest, I stood at Lookout Point, gazing across the vast expanse of Juniper Desert National Reserve. The Joshua tree where the photographs had been displayed had been carefully restored by park botanists, though it still bore the scars of that disturbing incident. The legal proceedings against Mercer had moved swiftly, faced with overwhelming evidence, including journals detailing his mission and trophies taken from his victims. He had accepted a plea deal that would keep him in a psychiatric facility for the foreseeable future. His confession had allowed authorities to close not just the 3 cases we knew about, but 2 additional murders that had occurred in neighboring state parks. Detective Rivera had visited me the previous week, bringing closure to the investigation. William Mercer's psychological evaluation had revealed a mind fractured by unprocessed grief and survivor's guilt. After his father's death, he had fixated on the Park Service as both saviors who rescued his remaining family and villains who failed to prevent the tragedy. This contradiction had festered during his military service, where he received training that he would later use to enact his distorted vision of justice. He created a narrative where rule breakers deserved punishment, Rivera had explained, and rangers who failed to enforce those rules were equally culpable. In his mind, he was performing a necessary service, making examples of people so others would learn, and targeting me specifically because I led the rescue operation for his family, I had added. Exactly. You represented both the system that failed his father and the face of that failure. His fixation on you became the core of his delusion. Now, as I looked out over the desert landscape, I tried to reconcile the beauty before me with the horrors that had unfolded here. The burned car site had been cleared, the scorched earth covered with native plants as part of a restoration project. The abandoned mine shaft had been properly sealed. Life in the park had gradually returned to normal, but I knew I would never see this place quite the same way again. The vastness that once represented freedom now reminded me of how easily people could disappear. The remoteness that once felt like solitude now whispered of vulnerability. The harsh beauty that had drawn me to this career now carried an edge of danger I couldn't ignore. Manny joined me at the lookout, handing me a cup of coffee from his thermos. "Still thinking about it?" he asked, knowing the answer. "Hard not to," I admitted. "Especially here. You could have transferred, you know. No one would have blamed you." I nodded. Several rangers had requested reassignment after the Mercer case, unable to continue working in a place so marked by tragedy. I had considered it myself, had even filled out the paperwork. "I thought about it," I said. "But in the end, I couldn't leave." "Why not?" I gestured toward the panoramic view before us, the towering mesas, the sweeping valleys, the ancient Joshua trees standing like sentinels across the landscape. "Because despite everything that happened, this place is still worth protecting. And the people who visit here still need someone looking out for them." Manny nodded in understanding. "So what now?" "Now we do our jobs better than before. We learn from what happened. We make sure no one else has to go through what the Mercer family went through." We stood in silence for a moment, watching a hawk circle lazily in the clear blue sky. The desert stretched out before us, neither good nor evil, neither kind nor cruel, simply a wild, untamed expanse that demanded respect. As we turned to leave, I noticed a small memorial plaque that had been installed near the lookout's guardrail, a simple bronze rectangle listing the names of all those who had perished in Juniper Desert National Reserve over the years. Joseph Mercer's name was among them, along with the victims of his son's misguided vengeance. I placed my hand briefly on the plaque, feeling the warmth of the sun-heated metal. This was the real legacy of what had happened, not just the horror and fear, but a renewed commitment to protecting both the wilderness and those who ventured into it. The desert would always hold dangers, both natural and human, but it would also continue to offer solace, beauty, and the profound sense of perspective that comes from standing in a landscape that dwarfs human concerns. My job was to help visitors navigate that duality safely, to respect the desert's power while experiencing its majesty. As Manny and I walked back to our truck, I took one last look at the vast horizon. The shadows were lengthening across the sand, creating patterns that would shift and change with the setting sun. Just like the park itself had changed me, irrevocably but not irreparably. The desert had shown me its darkest aspects, but in doing so, had also revealed the depth of my commitment to this place and this profession. Whatever nightmares might still come in the quiet hours of the night, I knew now that I belonged here, standing between the unforgiving wilderness and those who sought to experience it. Some scars never fully heal, but they remind us of what we've survived, what we've learned, and what we still have to protect. In the end, that's all any of us can ask for, the strength to face our fears and the wisdom to move forward, changed but unbroken, into whatever awaits on the horizon. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed an unforgiving 2:47 a.m. when I made the decision that would haunt me for weeks to come. Sleep had abandoned me entirely that Tuesday night in October 2019, leaving me staring at the ceiling of my cramped apartment near downtown. At 23, I should have been exhausted from my warehouse job, but instead my mind raced with the peculiar restlessness that seems to strike when the world grows too quiet. I reached for my phone and fired off a text to Jake and Vincent, knowing full well they were probably awake too. Anyone up for a drive? Feeling weird tonight? The responses came back within minutes. Both were experiencing the same inexplicable energy that demanded movement. Exploration, something to break the oppressive stillness of the early morning hours. We'd done this before, these spontaneous midnight expeditions through the outskirts of our small California city. Usually we'd cruise the empty highways, windows down, music low, letting the night air wash away whatever anxiety had built up during our mundane days. But tonight felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that made my skin crawl even before we'd left our respective homes. Jake arrived first in his battered Honda Civic, the engine's familiar rumble cutting through the silence. Vincent followed 10 minutes later, sliding into the back seat with the casual grace of someone accustomed to these nocturnal adventures. Neither of them looked particularly tired. Their eyes held the same wired alertness that had driven me from my bed. "Where to?" Jake asked, adjusting his rearview mirror. The question hung in the air for a moment as we considered our options. The usual routes felt insufficient tonight, too predictable for the strange mood that had settled over us. San Felipe Road, I heard myself say, the words emerging without conscious thought. The suggestion surprised even me. That particular stretch of asphalt held a reputation among locals, whispered stories that most people dismissed as urban legends. But something about the idea felt right, necessary even, like scratching an itch I hadn't realized was bothering me. Vincent shifted uncomfortably in the back seat. "That's pretty far out there, man. Middle of nowhere stuff." His voice carried a note of uncertainty, but also curiosity. We all knew the stories: strange sightings, unexplained phenomena, vehicles found abandoned with no trace of their occupants. Most rational people avoided the area entirely, especially after dark. Yet the pull was undeniable. The ordinary world felt suffocating tonight, and San Felipe Road represented something beyond the familiar boundaries of our small lives. As Jake turned the key and the engine responded with its reassuring rumble, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread that I couldn't quite explain. The dashboard clock read 3:03 a.m. as we pulled away from my apartment building, heading toward the edge of town where civilization gave way to empty hills and forgotten stretches of road. The streets were completely deserted as we navigated through the residential areas, past darkened houses where normal people slept peacefully in their beds. Streetlights cast pools of orange illumination that seemed inadequate against the pressing darkness beyond. I found myself studying every shadow, every alley, as if expecting something to emerge from the blackness. "You guys feel that?" Vincent asked from the back seat, his voice barely above a whisper. We all knew what he meant, that electric tension in the air, the sense that something significant was about to happen. Jake nodded grimly, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The transition from city to countryside happened gradually, then all at once. One moment we were passing the last gas station on the outskirts of town, its neon signs buzzing weakly in the darkness, and the next we were surrounded by rolling hills that seemed to swallow our headlights. The change in atmosphere was immediate and unsettling, as if we'd crossed some invisible threshold into a realm where different rules applied. San Felipe Road stretched ahead of us like a black ribbon cutting through the landscape. During daylight hours, this route probably looked unremarkable, just another rural highway connecting small communities. But at 3:30 in the morning, it felt like a passage into something far more sinister. The asphalt seemed to absorb our headlights rather than reflect them, creating the illusion that we were driving into an abyss. Jake had grown quieter since we'd left the city limits, his usual easy chatter replaced by tense concentration. The radio crackled with static as we moved further from civilization, picking up fragments of late-night talk shows and country music stations before dissolving into white noise. Eventually, he switched it off entirely, leaving us with only the hum of the engine and the whisper of wind through the partially open windows. The hills on either side of the road were covered in dense clusters of oak and pine trees that pressed close to the asphalt. In daylight, they might have seemed peaceful, even picturesque. But now they loomed like dark walls, their branches creating an impenetrable canopy that blocked out most of the starlight. I found myself imagining what might be lurking in those depths. Not supernatural creatures, but the very real predators that called these hills home. Mountain lions, wild boars, perhaps even bears venturing down from the higher elevations. Temperatures dropping, Vincent observed, pulling his jacket tighter around his shoulders. He was right. I could feel it too, a distinct chill that seemed to emanate from the landscape itself. The warmth from the car's heater felt inadequate against the cold that pressed against the windows. Jake checked the dashboard thermometer and frowned. Dropped 15 degrees in the last 10 minutes. That's not normal. His voice carried a note of concern that made my stomach tighten. Weather could change quickly in these hills, but such a sudden temperature drop seemed ominous, like a warning we were too foolish to heed. The road began to wind more sharply as we climbed into the higher elevations. Our headlights swept across guardrails that looked rusted and unreliable, offering little protection from the steep drops beyond. I could sense the emptiness on the other side of those flimsy barriers, valleys that plunged into darkness so complete it seemed almost solid. "How much further you want to go?" Jake asked, though his question sounded more like a plea for reassurance than a genuine inquiry. We were all feeling it now, that growing sense that we'd ventured too far from safety, that we were approaching something we weren't prepared to encounter. Before I could answer, the first wisps of fog began to appear in our headlights. At first it seemed harmless enough, just thin streamers of mist that drifted across the road like ghostly fingers. But within minutes, those wisps had thickened into something far more substantial and threatening. The fog didn't roll in gradually like a normal weather phenomenon. Instead, it seemed to materialize around us with deliberate intent, as if something in these hills had decided we'd gone far enough. One moment we could see a reasonable distance ahead, making out the curves and contours of the road, and the next, we were enveloped in a white-gray wall so thick it felt solid. Jake immediately slowed to a crawl, leaning forward over the steering wheel as he tried to navigate by the faint yellow lines barely visible in our headlights. The fog seemed to glow from within, creating an eerie luminescence that made depth perception impossible. Trees that should have been 50 feet away appeared to loom directly beside us, while the road itself seemed to shift and waver like something seen underwater. "This is insane." Vincent muttered from the back seat, his voice tight with anxiety. Fog doesn't just show up like this. Not this thick, not this fast. He was pressing his face against the side window, trying to make out anything beyond the milky barrier that surrounded us. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees almost instantly. I could see my breath forming small clouds inside the car, despite the heater running at full blast. The cold seemed to seep through the windows and doors, settling into my bones with an uncomfortable persistence. It was the kind of chill that made you think of morgues and underground caves, places where warmth never penetrated. Jake had reduced our speed to barely 10 miles per hour, but even that felt dangerously fast. The fog was so dense that our headlights only revealed a few feet of road ahead, creating the terrifying sensation that we might drive off a cliff at any moment. The normal sounds of the engine and tires seemed muffled, distorted by the thick air surrounding us. "Pull over," I said, my voice sounding strange in the confined space. "This is too dangerous. We need to wait it out." But even as I spoke, I realized we couldn't see the side of the road clearly enough to safely stop. We were trapped in a moving bubble of limited visibility, forced to keep inching forward through an alien landscape. That's when Vincent grabbed my shoulder, his fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. "There," he whispered, pointing through the windshield. "Do you see that?" At first I saw nothing but the usual wall of fog and the weak glow of our headlights. But as I stared harder, something began to resolve itself in the mist ahead. It was geometric, angular in a way that didn't belong in this natural setting. The shape seemed to shift and waver, sometimes appearing solid, other times translucent, as if it couldn't decide whether it wanted to exist in our reality. Jake brought the car to a complete stop, engine still running, all of us leaning forward to get a better look. The object, and it was definitely an object, not just a trick of light and fog, appeared to be roughly rectangular, about the size of a small building. But its edges weren't quite right, seeming to bend and flow in ways that hurt to look at directly. "What the hell is that thing?" Jake's voice was barely audible, filled with the kind of fear that comes from encountering something that challenges your fundamental understanding of how the world works. The shape seemed to pulse with its own internal light, casting shadows that moved independently of any visible light source. As we watched, frozen in fascination and terror, it began to drift slowly across the road, passing through the beam of our headlights like smoke. But it cast a shadow on the fog behind it, a solid, dark silhouette that proved this was no mere optical illusion. My heart was hammering against my ribs, each beat echoing in my ears like thunder. Every instinct screamed at me to tell Jake to reverse, to get us away from whatever we were witnessing. But I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything, but stare at this impossible thing that defied explanation. The temperature inside the car dropped so quickly I could see ice crystals forming on the inside of the windows, just as the rectangular anomaly drifted beyond our headlights and dissolved back into the fog. Vincent's scream shattered the tense silence. His cry was raw, primal, the sound of someone whose mind had encountered something too terrible to process rationally. He was pointing frantically at something above and to our right, his entire body shaking as he pressed himself against the far side of the car. "In the tree," he shouted. "Oh God, look at the tree." Following his gesture, I turned my attention to the massive oak that loomed beside the road. Through the swirling mist, I could make out its enormous trunk, easily 6 feet in diameter, with bark so dark it seemed to absorb what little light reached it. The tree was ancient, probably centuries old, its branches stretching far above us into the fog-shrouded canopy. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but as my eyes adjusted to the strange interplay of fog and shadow, something began to resolve itself against the trunk. About 20 feet up, clinging to the bark with what appeared to be powerful limbs, was a shape that made my mind rebel against accepting what my eyes were reporting. The thing was large, easily the size of a grown man, but broader, more muscular. Its body seemed covered in dark, matted fur that gleamed wetly in the diffused light from our headlights. But it was the way it moved that triggered the deepest, most primitive fear centers in my brain. This wasn't the random motion of branches swaying in wind. This was purposeful, deliberate, the calculated movement of something that was very much alive and very aware of our presence. Jake had gone completely rigid behind the wheel, his breathing shallow and rapid. "That's not possible," he whispered. "That can't be real." But his voice carried no conviction, We could all see it now. This impossible thing that defied every rational explanation. The creature, and there was no denying that's what it was, seemed to be studying us with the same intensity that we were watching it. I caught glimpses of what might have been eyes, reflecting our headlights with an eerie amber glow. Its head turned slowly from side to side, and I had the distinct impression it was evaluating us, determining whether we represented a threat or merely an annoyance. The fog swirled around the tree trunk, sometimes obscuring our view completely before parting again to reveal the thing still there, still watching. Its claws, and they were definitely claws, long and curved like those of a massive predator, scraped against the bark with a sound that reached us even through the closed windows of the car. The scraping was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers while deep in thought. "We need to go," Vincent said, his voice breaking. "We need to go right now." But Jake seemed paralyzed, unable to take his eyes off the creature. I could understand his fascination. There was something hypnotic about the thing, something that demanded attention, even as every survival instinct screamed warnings. The temperature inside the car had become so cold that our breath formed thick clouds with each exhalation. Ice was forming on the inside of the windshield, creating crystalline patterns that further distorted our view. The heater, which had been running at maximum, seemed to have no effect against the supernatural chill that surrounded us. Then the creature began to move. It descended the tree trunk with fluid grace, its claws finding purchase in the bark with ease. Each movement was precise, controlled, like a dancer performing a routine it had practiced countless times. As it came closer to ground level, more details became visible. The powerful musculature beneath the fur, the way its spine curved in a manner not quite human, not quite animal. "Floor it," I shouted, finally finding my voice. "Get us out of here now." Jake's paralysis broke instantly. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator, and the car lurched forward with a roar of engine noise that seemed unnaturally loud in the fog-muffled landscape. The tires spun for a moment on the damp asphalt before finding traction, and suddenly we were racing blind through the white wall that surrounded us. Our escape through the fog was a nightmare of adrenaline and terror. Jake drove with desperate intensity, pushing the car far faster than was safe given our limited visibility. The speedometer climbed to 30, then 40 miles per hour as we raced through the white void, our headlights carving out a narrow tunnel of illumination that revealed only seconds' worth of warning about curves or obstacles ahead. Vincent was hyperventilating in the back seat, his breathing coming in short, sharp gasps that fogged the windows even more. Between breaths, he kept muttering fragments of what we'd seen, descriptions that became more elaborate and terrifying with each repetition. "Did you see its face? Did you see the way it looked at us? Those weren't animal eyes. Those were something else entirely." I found myself gripping the door handle so tightly my knuckles had gone white, bracing for the impact I was certain would come. Every curve in the road brought the possibility of disaster, a collision with another vehicle, a plunge over a guardrail, or worse, whatever was lurking in these hills. The fog seemed to press against the windows like living thing, as if it were trying to slow our escape. The engine roared at maximum RPM as Jake pushed the car beyond its normal limits. I could hear strain in the motor's voice, a metallic whining that suggested we were asking more of the aging Honda than it was designed to give. But none of us cared about mechanical damage. Our only concern was putting distance between ourselves and whatever we'd encountered back there. "It was following us," Vincent said suddenly, his voice cutting through the engine noise. "When we first started moving, I saw it drop down from the tree. It was coming after us." His words sent fresh waves of panic through the car. I twisted around to look through the rear window, but the fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet behind us. The temperature was slowly beginning to rise as we drove, the supernatural chill gradually giving way to something more normal. The ice on the windows started to melt, creating streaks of water that distorted our view in new and different ways. But the return of normal temperature felt like a small victory, a sign that we were escaping whatever pocket of wrongness we'd driven into. Jake's driving was becoming increasingly erratic as exhaustion and fear took their toll. The car weaved slightly from side to side as he fought to keep us on the road, while managing the overwhelming urge to look back, to confirm we weren't being pursued by something that shouldn't exist. Several times we drifted close to the edge of the asphalt before he corrected our course with sharp, overcorrecting turns. "There," I shouted as the fog began to thin ahead of us. "I can see clear road." The mist was breaking apart like smoke, revealing patches of normal highway illuminated by our headlights. Stars were visible again through gaps in the clouds, and the oppressive sense of being trapped in an alien environment was beginning to lift. We burst out of the fog wall as suddenly as we'd entered it, emerging into a clear night that felt like stepping into a different world. The transition was so abrupt it was disorienting. One moment we were driving blind through supernatural mist, and the next we were on a normal stretch of highway with good visibility and recognizable landmarks. Jake immediately pulled over to the shoulder, his hands shaking as he put the car in park. We sat in stunned silence for several minutes, listening to our own labored breathing and the ticking of the cooling engine. The normal sounds of night in the California hills, insects chirping, wind through grass, the distant hoot of an owl, felt almost miraculous after the muffled silence of the fog. "Did that really happen?" Vincent asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Tell me we didn't just imagine all of that." But we all knew it had been real. The evidence was written in our racing hearts, our trembling hands, the cold sweat that covered our bodies despite the now normal temperature. 3 days passed before any of us could speak about what we'd experienced without our voices shaking. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that we'd encountered nothing more than unusual weather conditions and overactive imaginations fueled by local folklore. But the visceral memory of that night, the supernatural cold, the impossible geometry of the fog-shrouded shape, the creature clinging to the ancient oak, refused to be dismissed as mere hallucination. By Friday evening, curiosity had begun to overpower fear. We met at Jake's apartment, ostensibly to watch a movie, but really to discuss what we'd seen and decide whether we had the courage to return. The conversation started cautiously, each of us testing whether the others were ready to revisit that night. But it quickly became clear that we were all obsessed with finding answers. "I've been researching the area," Vincent said, pulling out his laptop. "San Felipe Road has a history. Not just urban legends, actual documented incidents going back decades." He'd compiled a collection of newspaper articles, police reports, and personal accounts that painted a disturbing picture of the region. The documents told stories of vehicles found abandoned with their engines still running, drivers nowhere to be found. Hikers who'd gone missing in the hills, their remains discovered months later in locations that made no sense given their intended routes. Strange atmospheric phenomena reported by pilots flying over the area, fog that appeared and disappeared without meteorological explanation, temperature anomalies that showed up on weather instruments but couldn't be accounted for by normal conditions. "Look at this," Vincent said, highlighting a police report from 2015. Family of 4 driving through the area at night. Found their car in a ditch, all the doors open, personal belongings scattered like they'd fled in panic. No signs of an accident, no evidence of foul play. They were found 6 hours later walking along Highway 101, 20 miles away, with no memory of how they'd gotten there. Jake leaned over to read the report more carefully. "Says here they kept talking about seeing something in the trees. Described it as a large, dark figure that didn't move like any animal they'd ever seen." Sound familiar? The description sent chills down my spine. It was almost identical to what we'd witnessed. More articles revealed a pattern of encounters that stretched back generations. Native American tribes had considered the area sacred but dangerous, warning of spirits that could take physical form and lead travelers astray. Early Spanish settlers reported similar phenomena, describing them in terms of their Catholic worldview, demons and unholy apparitions that tested the faith of good Christians. "Here's what I think," I said, trying to organize the swirling thoughts that had been plaguing me all week. "Whatever's out there, it's not supernatural in the traditional sense. It's something real, something physical, but operating according to rules we don't understand. The fog, the temperature changes, the way that thing moved, it all suggests some kind of natural phenomenon that science hasn't explained yet." Vincent nodded thoughtfully. "Like ball lightning or those rogue waves sailors used to report. Seemed impossible until we understood the science behind them." It was a comforting theory. that we'd encountered something extraordinary but ultimately explainable, rather than something that challenged the fundamental nature of reality. But even as we tried to rationalize our experience, the fear remained. Whatever we'd seen on San Felipe Road had left all of us fundamentally changed. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of fog-shrouded highways and amber eyes watching from the darkness. We found ourselves avoiding certain streets at night, staying away from wooded areas, jumping at shadows that moved in ways our subconscious minds found threatening. "We have to go back," Jake said finally. "I can't live with not knowing. This thing is going to drive me crazy if I don't get some kind of answer." Vincent and I exchanged glances, recognizing our own desperation reflected in his words. The uncertainty was almost worse than the fear. At least terror had a definite quality to it, while doubt corroded everything. "Okay," I agreed. "But we do this smart. We bring cameras, recording equipment, maybe some basic scientific instruments. If there's something out there, we document it properly. No more running away in blind panic." The plan felt reasonable, professional even, but my heart was already racing at the thought of returning to that haunted stretch of road. We spent the better part of Saturday preparing for our return expedition. Jake borrowed a digital camera with night vision capabilities from a friend who worked in security. Vincent procured a digital thermometer, electromagnetic field detector, and a handheld GPS unit that could record our exact location and track our movements. I contributed a portable audio recorder and several powerful flashlights, along with extra batteries for everything. The equipment made us feel more professional, more prepared, but it couldn't mask the underlying terror that had been building all day. By the time we loaded everything into Jake's car, my hands were already shaking slightly, and I could see similar signs of stress in my companions. Vincent had developed a nervous tic, constantly checking and rechecking the batteries in our various devices. Jake chain-smoked cigarettes despite having quit months earlier, the nicotine doing little to calm his obvious anxiety. We waited until 11 p.m. to begin the drive, reasoning that we'd reach San Felipe Road around the same time as our previous encounter. The logic was sound. If whatever we'd seen was tied to specific conditions or timing, we wanted to recreate the circumstances as closely as possible. But as we navigated the increasingly empty streets leading out of town, the familiar dread began to settle over us like a suffocating blanket. The temperature was significantly warmer than it had been during our first visit, and the weather forecast called for clear skies with no chance of fog. These factors should have been reassuring, suggesting we might encounter nothing more than a peaceful drive through rural California. Instead, they felt ominous, as if the very absence of threatening weather conditions was itself a trap. "Everyone's phones fully charged?" Vincent asked for the third time. We'd agreed that if anything went wrong, our first priority would be to call for help, though the cellular coverage in the hills was notoriously unreliable. The question had become a kind of nervous ritual, something to break the oppressive silence that had settled over us as we drove deeper into the countryside. The transition to San Felipe Road felt different this time. Instead of the gradual shift from civilization to wilderness, I was acutely aware of crossing a threshold. The moment our tires touched that particular stretch of asphalt, the atmosphere inside the car changed. Our casual conversation stopped abruptly, replaced by tense vigilance as we scanned the darkness ahead. Jake had slowed to a more cautious speed, maintaining about 30 miles per hour as we approached the area where we'd encountered the fog. The night was crystal clear, with excellent visibility and a half moon providing enough ambient light to make out the contours of the surrounding hills. Trees that had been invisible barriers during our first visit now stood clearly defined against the star-filled sky. "There's the tree," I said, pointing to the massive oak that had hosted our terrifying visitor. In the moonlight, it looked ancient but benign, its branches swaying gently in a light breeze. No fog, no supernatural chill, no impossible creatures clinging to its bark, just an old tree beside a rural highway, exactly as it probably appeared during thousands of unremarkable days and nights. We pulled over at the exact spot where we'd stopped before, Jake positioning the car so our headlights illuminated the base of the oak. The digital thermometer showed a normal 52 degrees Fahrenheit, cool for October, but nothing unusual for this elevation and time of night. The electromagnetic field detector registered only the background readings you'd expect in any natural environment. Should we get out? Vincent asked, though his tone suggested he hoped the answer would be no. We discussed this possibility during our planning session, agreeing that a closer examination might provide evidence we'd missed while trapped in the car. But now, sitting in the actual location with darkness pressing against our windows, the idea seemed far less appealing. I opened my door first, partly to demonstrate courage I didn't feel, and partly because waiting any longer would only increase our collective anxiety. The night air was crisp and carried the scents of pine and oak leaves, perfectly normal forest smells that should have been comforting. Instead, every natural sound seemed amplified and threatening. An owl's hoot made me jump, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush triggered waves of paranoia. Jake and Vincent followed my lead, though they stayed close to the car, ready to dive back inside at the first sign of danger. We approached the oak tree with the cautious reverence of archaeologists entering a tomb, our flashlights creating overlapping pools of illumination that revealed nothing more supernatural than ordinary bark and fallen leaves. "Look at this," Vincent said, directing his light to a section of trunk about 8 feet off the ground. Deep gouges scarred the bark, 4 parallel marks that could have been made by claws. But they were old, weathered by seasons of rain and wind, impossible to date with any accuracy. They might have been made by a bear marking its territory, or by some piece of farm equipment decades ago. We spent nearly an hour examining the tree and surrounding area, finding nothing that definitively proved or disproved our earlier experience. The lack of evidence was almost more disturbing than finding clear proof would have been. It left us trapped in uncertainty, unable to move forward or back. The weeks following our second visit to San Felipe Road brought no peace, only a deeper, more persistent kind of terror that wove itself into the fabric of our daily lives. Unlike the sharp, immediate fear of our original encounter, this was a slow-burning anxiety that colored everything we did. Sleep became elusive and unsatisfying, filled with dreams that felt more like memories of experiences we'd never actually had. My dreams were remarkably consistent in their imagery and emotional tone. I would find myself walking alone along San Felipe Road in complete darkness, guided only by an amber glow that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. The pavement beneath my feet would be wet despite the absence of rain, and my breath would form visible clouds in air that grew colder with each step. Always, I could sense something following me, matching my pace exactly, never quite visible when I turned to look, but undeniably present. These nocturnal visions were so vivid that I often woke with the scent of pine and damp earth still in my nostrils, my heart racing as if I'd actually been walking through those haunted hills. The boundary between dream and reality became increasingly blurred, especially during the vulnerable moments between sleep and wakefulness when my mind struggled to distinguish between memory and imagination. Jake reported similar experiences. Though his dreams took a different form, he described being trapped in his car on an endless version of San Felipe Road, driving through fog so thick it seemed solid while something kept pace alongside his vehicle. He could never see what was running parallel to the car, but he could hear it, footsteps that matched his speed exactly, breathing that fogged the windows from the outside, occasional scratching sounds as claws made contact with metal and glass. Vincent's psychological response was perhaps the most disturbing. He developed an intense aversion to trees, particularly large oaks, that made it difficult for him to walk through any wooded area without experiencing panic attacks. The rational part of his mind understood that most trees posed no threat, but his nervous system had apparently decided that anything resembling the massive oak we'd encountered represented mortal danger. Our relationships with friends and family began to strain as we struggled to explain our changed behavior without sounding delusional. How do you tell someone you're afraid to drive alone at night because you might encounter something that shouldn't exist? How do you explain why you've started sleeping with every light in your apartment turned on, or why certain sounds make you freeze with terror? I found myself researching sleep disorders, anxiety conditions, and group psychology, desperately seeking some rational explanation for what we were experiencing. Post-traumatic stress disorder seemed like a possibility, but that typically resulted from witnessing or experiencing actual trauma. Could a single night of uncertainty and fear really have such lasting psychological effects? The internet provided access to countless accounts of similar experiences, people who claimed to have encountered unexplained phenomena and struggled with the aftermath. Support groups existed for individuals who'd witnessed UFOs, cryptid creatures, or paranormal activity. Reading their stories provided some comfort, but also raised troubling questions about the nature of reality and the reliability of human perception. 3 months after our initial encounter, I made a decision that surprised even me. I would return to San Felipe Road alone, without the safety net of companions or the distraction of conversation. If something was genuinely haunting that stretch of highway, I needed to confront it directly. If our experience had been nothing more than shared delusion fueled by local folklore and atmospheric conditions, then a solitary visit under calm circumstances should prove that conclusively. The drive out to San Felipe Road on that February night felt like a journey to my own execution. Every mile brought increasing dread, but also a strange sense of resolution. Whatever happened, I would finally have definitive answers about what we'd encountered, or I would prove to myself that the whole experience had been psychological rather than supernatural. As I turned onto that familiar stretch of asphalt, my headlights swept across the massive oak tree that had become the focal point of my nightmares. It stood unchanged, ancient and imposing, its branches reaching toward a star-filled sky. No fog, no supernatural cold, no impossible creatures watching from the darkness. I parked in the exact spot where we'd stopped months earlier and turned off the engine. The silence was complete except for the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of wind through the trees. I sat there for nearly an hour, windows down, waiting for some sign that the terror we'd experienced had been real. Nothing happened. The night remained peaceful, ordinary, exactly what you'd expect from a rural highway in the California hills. As I finally started the engine and began the drive home, I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. The mystery would remain unsolved, but perhaps that was preferable to the alternative. Yet even now, months later, I avoid San Felipe Road after dark. Some knowledge I've decided isn't worth pursuing. Some questions are better left unanswered, and some roads are meant to be traveled only in daylight, when shadows hold no secrets and the impossible seems safely distant. The three of us rarely discuss that night anymore, but we remain bound by the shared knowledge that we encountered something beyond our understanding, whether it was supernatural, psychological, or something else entirely. It changed us in ways that continue to echo through our lives. We learned that the world contains mysteries that resist rational explanation, and sometimes the wisest response is simply to acknowledge our limitations and move forward as best we can. The road remains, winding through those dark hills, waiting for the next group of curious night travelers to discover what lurks in the fog. The dashboard clock glowed 3:47 a.m. when I realized I had made a terrible mistake. I should have stopped hours ago, should have found a motel room somewhere back in the last town, but stubbornness and the promise of reaching my destination before dawn had kept me pressing forward. Now, with my eyelids growing heavy and my hands cramping around the steering wheel, I was paying the price for that decision. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of cracked asphalt disappearing into absolute darkness. My headlights carved a weak tunnel through the night, illuminating nothing but empty road and the occasional reflective sign marking another mile conquered. The heater in my old pickup truck wheezed and rattled, fighting a losing battle against the October cold that seeped through every gap and crack in the weathered cab. I had been driving for 6 hours straight, fleeing a job that had gone sour and a relationship that had turned toxic. Everything I owned was packed into the bed of the truck, covered by a tarp that flapped ominously in the wind. At 32 years old, I was starting over again, heading toward a construction job in Nevada that promised decent pay and a chance to rebuild my life. But first, I had to survive this endless night. The radio had given up broadcasting anything coherent an hour ago, leaving me with only static and the occasional burst of Spanish-language music from some distant station. I twisted the dial desperately, searching for human voices to keep me company, but found only electronic whispers and empty frequencies. The isolation pressed against my chest like a physical weight. My fuel gauge hovered just above the quarter tank mark, its orange needle pointing accusingly at my poor planning. I had passed the last gas station nearly 50 miles back, dismissing it because the lights were off and it looked abandoned. Now, as the needle crept lower, I was beginning to regret that decision. The thought of running out of gas on this desolate stretch of highway, miles from any help, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold air. The landscape outside remained stubbornly unchanging. Flat scrubland dotted with stunted trees and the occasional abandoned building. No cities glowed on the horizon, no traffic shared the road. It was as if I had driven beyond the edge of civilization into some forgotten corner of the world where normal rules no longer applied. When I finally spotted the lights ahead, my first emotion was pure relief. After another hour of driving through the darkness, watching my fuel gauge needle sink closer to empty, any sign of human presence looked like salvation. But as I drew closer, my relief began to curdle into something else entirely. The gas station emerged from the darkness like something from a fever dream. A single flickering street lamp cast sickly yellow light over the scene, revealing a structure that seemed frozen in time from decades past. The building's white paint had peeled away in long strips, exposing gray wood underneath that looked soft with rot. The windows of what had once been a convenience store were boarded up with plywood, and the few panes of glass that remained were so grimy they looked black in the uncertain light. 2 ancient gas pumps stood like tombstones in the center of the lot, their digital displays dark and lifeless. But one pump, the one closest to the road, still had a faint glow emanating from its card reader. The sight of that tiny red light filled me with desperate hope. I pulled up beside it, the truck's engine ticking as it cooled, and stepped out into the biting air. The silence was overwhelming. No traffic sounds, no distant hum of machinery, no voices or music from inside the building. Just the whisper of wind through dry grass and the soft buzz of the failing street lamp. The cold bit into my exposed skin immediately, making me pull my jacket tighter around my chest. My breath formed visible clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air. I approached the pump with cautious optimism, sliding my credit card through the reader and waiting for some sign of life. The machine wheezed and clicked, its internal mechanism struggling to process the transaction. After what felt like an eternity, the display flickered to life, instructing me to select my fuel grade. I had never been so happy to see those glowing numbers. As I began filling my tank, the smell of gasoline sharp in my nostrils, I took a closer look at my surroundings. The building behind the pumps was larger than I had initially thought, with additional structures extending back into the shadows. What I had taken for abandonment might have been something else entirely. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt beside the building, and a few scattered cigarette butts that looked recently discarded. That was when I noticed the black sedan parked in the shadows behind the main building. At first it was just a darker patch of night, but as my eyes adjusted I could make out its sleek lines and tinted windows. The car was pristine, expensive looking, completely out of place in this desolate setting. And standing around it, barely visible in the darkness, were the silhouettes of several men. My heart began to hammer against my ribs as I realized I was not alone. The figures by the black sedan had been so still, so perfectly camouflaged by the darkness, that I had nearly finished fueling before I noticed them. Now that I was aware of their presence, I could not look away. There were 4 of them, all young men in their 20s, dressed inappropriately for the cold night air. They wore tank tops and shorts despite the freezing temperature, their exposed arms covered in elaborate tattoos that seemed to shift and crawl in the uncertain light. They stood with the casual confidence of predators, completely relaxed despite the circumstances that should have left them shivering. What disturbed me most was their absolute stillness. They were not talking among themselves, not smoking cigarettes or checking their phones. They were simply standing there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Even from 50 yards away, I could feel the weight of their collective gaze, studying my every movement as I fumbled with the gas pump. The pump clicked off, signaling that my tank was full, but I found myself reluctant to move. Any motion would draw their attention more directly, might provoke some kind of response. But standing frozen by my truck was not a viable long-term strategy. I needed to get back on the road, to put distance between myself and whatever situation I had stumbled into. I forced myself to move slowly and deliberately, replacing the pump handle and screwing the gas cap back into place. My hands trembled slightly, whether from cold or fear I could not say. The metallic sound seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence, each click and scrape echoing off the surrounding buildings. As I walked around to the driver's side of my truck, I risked another glance toward the sedan. All four men had shifted their positions slightly, turning to keep me in their line of sight. The movement was synchronized, almost rehearsed, as if they had done this many times before. One of them took a single step forward, then stopped, waiting. I reached for the door handle of my truck and froze. The men were moving now, no longer content to simply observe. They approached with measured steps, spreading out slightly as they came, their movements coordinated and purposeful. There was nothing casual about their advance, nothing that suggested this was a friendly approach. Terror flooded my system with a rush of adrenaline that made my vision sharpen and my hearing intensify. Every detail became crystal clear: the soft scuff of their shoes on gravel, the whisper of fabric against skin, the faint sound of their breathing in the cold air. My rational mind screamed at me to run, to get in the truck and drive away as fast as possible. I yanked open the driver's door and threw myself inside, my hands shaking as I turned the key. The engine hesitated for a moment that felt like an eternity, then roared to life with a sound that seemed to shatter the night's silence. In the rearview mirror, I could see the four men break into a run, no longer bothering with their slow, intimidating approach. The truck lurched forward as I slammed the accelerator to the floor, tires spinning on the loose gravel before finding purchase on the pavement. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my hands gripped the steering wheel with desperate strength. Behind me, the four men had reached their sedan, and I could see movement in the darkness as they prepared to follow. I had perhaps a 30-second head start, but that black sedan looked built for speed, while my pickup truck was designed for hauling loads, not racing. Still, I had one advantage they might not expect. Beneath the hood of my weathered truck sat a carefully modified engine that had been my pride and joy back when I had money for such luxuries. What looked like a working man's beater was actually capable of surprising performance. The speedometer needle climbed rapidly as I pushed the truck harder than I had ever pushed it before. 60 miles per hour, then 70, then 80. The engine responded beautifully, its deep rumble growing to a roar that vibrated through the steering wheel and into my bones. But even as I accelerated, I could see headlights appearing in my rearview mirror, growing brighter as the sedan emerged from the gas station. The highway ahead remained empty and straight, offering no opportunities to lose my pursuers through clever maneuvering. This would be a pure test of speed and endurance, machine against machine, with my life hanging in the balance. The thought of what might happen if they caught me sent another surge of adrenaline through my system. At 90 miles per hour, the truck began to shake slightly, wind noise roaring through the cab despite the closed windows. The yellow lines on the road blurred beneath my headlights, and distant objects seemed to materialize and vanish in seconds. I had never driven this fast in my life, but I had never been running for my life before either. The sedan was gaining ground. In my mirror, I could see its headlights growing larger, the distance between us shrinking with each passing second. Whatever engine that car was carrying, it was more powerful than my modified pickup, but I still had tricks to play. I knew this highway better than they might expect. About 10 miles ahead, there was a series of rolling hills that would test both vehicles' handling capabilities. If I could maintain my lead until then, I might be able to use the terrain to my advantage. The question was whether my truck could hold together under this punishment long enough to reach that section of road. The speedometer now showed 95 miles per hour, and the truck was protesting audibly. Strange rattles and vibrations shook the cab, and I could smell something burning, though whether it was clutch, brakes, or something worse I could not tell. But the engine continued to respond, continued to pull us forward through the night. Behind me, the sedan had closed to within a few hundred yards. At these speeds, that represented only seconds of separation. I could make out individual details now: the car's aggressive front end, the glow of its instrument lights through the windshield, the dark shapes of its occupants. They were so close I half expected to hear their engine over the roar of my own. The chase had been going on for 20 minutes when I began to realize the true nature of what I was dealing with. These were not random criminals looking for an easy target. The coordination of their pursuit, the quality of their vehicle, the professional way they maintained their distance while steadily closing the gap, all pointed to something far more dangerous than simple highway robbery. My truck was giving everything it had, but physics was working against me. The sedan was simply more aerodynamic, more powerful, better suited for high-speed pursuit. At 100 miles per hour, I was approaching the absolute limit of what my modified pickup could handle, while my pursuers seemed to have power in reserve. The hills I had been hoping to reach appeared in my headlights, the highway beginning to rise and fall in gentle curves that would test both vehicles' suspension and handling. But as we crested the first hill, I realized my mistake. The sedan was not just faster in a straight line. It was also more agile, taking the curves with a stability that my top-heavy truck could not match. On the downslope of the second hill, they made their move. The sedan pulled into the left lane and began to overtake me, its engine note rising as its driver downshifted for maximum acceleration. I could see the passenger side window rolling down, and the terrible realization hit me that this was about to become something far worse than a simple chase. I swerved hard to the left, trying to force them back behind me, but the sedan's driver was ready for the maneuver. He dropped back slightly, then moved to the right lane, attempting to come up on my passenger side instead. The highway was wide enough for both vehicles, but just barely, and at these speeds any contact would likely be fatal for both of us. That was when I understood their strategy. They were not trying to ram me off the road. They were trying to box me in, to force me to stop so they could handle whatever business they had with me face to face. The thought of what that business might entail made my blood run cold. I had one more card to play. About a mile ahead, I knew there was an exit ramp leading to a smaller county road. It was a sharp right turn that would be difficult to take at high speed, but if I could make it and they could not, I might be able to lose them in the maze of rural back roads that crisscross this part of the state. The exit sign flashed by in my headlights. 1 mile. The sedan was still trying to pull alongside me, its driver showing impressive skill as he matched my erratic movements. I could see the faces of the occupants now, grim and focused, their attention completely fixed on their task. Whatever they wanted with me, they were professionals. Half a mile. I began to ease off the accelerator slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to make the upcoming maneuver possible. The sedan's driver noticed immediately, pulling even closer, sensing that something was about to happen. The exit ramp appeared suddenly, a sharp right turn marked by a series of yellow warning signs indicating a safe speed of 25 miles per hour. I was doing nearly 90 when I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right and stood on the brakes. The truck went into a controlled slide that tested every modification I had ever made to its suspension system. The rear wheels broke loose first, sending the back end sliding wide as I fought to maintain control. The steering wheel spun in my hands as I tried to counteract the skid, my foot pumping the brake pedal in short, desperate bursts. For a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to flip. The truck tilted up on 2 wheels as it rounded the curve, gravity and centrifugal force battling for control of my fate. Time seemed to stretch as I hung there, balanced on the edge of disaster, the night sky wheeling overhead through the passenger window. Then the outside wheels touched down again, and I was through the worst of it. The truck straightened out on the narrow county road, its engine coughing and protesting but still running. I had made the turn, but just barely, and at a cost that my vehicle would be paying for miles to come. Behind me, I heard the screech of tires and the angry blare of a horn as the sedan's driver attempted the same maneuver. But their car was moving too fast, carrying too much momentum to make such a sharp turn. I watched in my mirror as they shot past the exit, their brake lights flashing desperately as they tried to slow down enough to attempt a U-turn. The county road was narrow and winding, bordered by ditches and wooden fence posts. It was exactly the kind of terrain where my truck's higher ground clearance and 4-wheel drive would give me an advantage over their low-slung sedan. But I was not out of danger yet. These roads formed a network that eventually connected back to the main highway, and my pursuers would know that as well as I did. I drove hard for another 10 minutes, taking random turns whenever the road forked, trying to put as much distance and confusion between myself and my pursuers as possible. The adrenaline was beginning to fade now, replaced by exhaustion and the shaky aftermath of extreme fear. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and I could taste copper in my mouth where I had bitten my tongue during the chase. Finally, I found what I was looking for, an old ranch road that led away from the main network of county highways. It was little more than 2 tire tracks separated by a strip of weeds, but it would take me deeper into the countryside, away from any road that might appear on a standard map. I turned onto it and drove slowly, trying not to think about what would happen if I got stuck out here. The ranch road led to an abandoned farmstead, its buildings dark and empty against the star-filled sky. I pulled behind the largest barn and shut off the engine, sitting in the sudden silence and listening for any sound of pursuit. All I could hear was the ticking of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through broken windows. I waited there for 2 hours, watching the road behind me and jumping at every small sound. No headlights appeared. No engines disturbed the night. Gradually, I began to believe that I had actually escaped, that my desperate gamble with the exit ramp had worked. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, I finally felt safe enough to continue my journey. But I took the back roads now, avoiding the highway where this nightmare had begun, and I drove with frequent glances in my mirrors, knowing that some encounters leave scars that never fully heal. 3 days later, I was sitting in a diner in Reno, Nevada, trying to pretend that the coffee in my cup was not shaking from the tremor in my hands. I had made it to my new job, had even managed to work for 2 days without breaking down, but the nights were proving to be a different challenge entirely. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 4 figures approaching my truck, their movements coordinated and predatory. The local news was playing on the television mounted above the counter, and I was only half listening when a story caught my attention. The reporter was standing in front of a familiar-looking gas station, the same sickly yellow street lamp casting its pool of light over the same peeling building I remembered from my nightmare. Encounter. Discovered this morning by state police investigating reports of suspicious activity. The remote station, located on Highway 50 approximately 30 miles east of Fallon, has apparently been used as a staging area for drug trafficking operations. Authorities recovered nearly 50 pounds of methamphetamine and heroin, along with weapons and cash totaling over $200,000. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands and stared at the screen. The reporter continued her story, but I was no longer hearing the words. All I could see was that building, those pumps, the exact spot where I had stood 3 nights ago while 4 armed drug dealers watched me from the shadows. The investigation began when a motorist reported being chased by suspected cartel members after stopping at the station for fuel. Nevada State Police credit that anonymous tip with leading them to what they describe as a significant blow to regional drug trafficking operations. Anonymous tip. I had not called the police, had been too shaken and too afraid that they would not believe my story. Someone else must have seen something, must have reported the suspicious activity at the station, but the timing was too convenient, the details too specific for coincidence. I walked to the payphone outside the diner and dialed the number for Nevada State Police, my hands still trembling as I punched in the numbers. When the dispatcher answered, I took a deep breath and identified myself as the motorist who had encountered the suspects at the highway station. The detective who took my statement was thorough and professional, asking detailed questions about the men I had seen, their vehicle, and the timeline of events. He seemed unsurprised by my account, as if he had been expecting my call. You were lucky, he told me when I finished my story. These were not random criminals looking for a quick score. The group you encountered was part of a sophisticated operation that has been moving drugs through this corridor for months. They were armed and dangerous, and they do not leave witnesses. The weight of those words settled over me like a cold blanket. I had not just escaped a robbery attempt. I had fled from people who would have killed me without hesitation to protect their operation. The thought made my legs weak, and I had to sit down on the curb outside the diner. The good news, the detective continued, is that we got them all. 4 suspects in custody, along with their vehicle and a substantial quantity of narcotics. Your description of their car was instrumental in identifying them when they were spotted the next day. I hung up the phone and sat there in the Nevada sun, trying to process what I had learned. Random chance had put me in the path of killers, and random chance had allowed me to escape. But it was more than luck that had saved me. It was the modifications I had made to my truck, the knowledge of local roads I had gained from years of construction work, and a willingness to take desperate risks when my life depended on it. 2 months have passed since that night on Highway 50, and I am finally beginning to sleep through the night again. The construction job in Nevada turned out well, providing steady work and decent pay in a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business. It is the kind of place where strangers are noticed immediately, where four young men in an expensive sedan would have drawn attention long before they could set up any kind of criminal operation. But the experience has changed me in ways that go beyond simple caution. I no longer drive alone at night unless absolutely necessary, and when I do, I plan my route carefully, making sure I know where every gas station, restaurant, and police station is located. The days of driving until exhaustion forces me to stop are over. I have learned that being prepared can mean the difference between life and death. I keep in touch with Detective Morrison at the Nevada State Police, who updates me occasionally on the progress of the case against my would-be pursuers. The investigation revealed that the gas station had been used as a distribution point for drugs moving from Mexico to markets in the Pacific Northwest. The operation was sophisticated and well-funded, with connections to major cartel organizations. The four men I encountered that night have been charged with numerous federal crimes, including drug trafficking, weapons violations, and conspiracy. Their sentences, when they come, will likely measure in decades rather than years. I will probably be called to testify at their trial, a prospect that fills me with dread and determination in equal measure. What haunts me most is not what happened, but what could have happened. If my truck had been slower, if I had not known about that exit ramp, if I had made any number of different decisions that night, I would not be here to tell this story. The margin between escape and disaster was measured in seconds and split-second decisions. I have also learned something about myself that night. When faced with mortal danger, when reduced to the most basic choice between fight and flight, I discovered reserves of courage and determination I never knew I possessed. The modifications I had made to my truck were not just mechanical improvements. They were preparations for a test I never expected to face. The truck itself bears scars from that night. Stress fractures in the suspension, worn brake pads, and a transmission that will never quite shift the same way again. But it brought me through when I needed it most, and I will never forget that debt. Sometimes, late at night, when sleep refuses to come, I think about the other travelers who might have stopped at that station before me. The ones who were not as lucky, who did not have a fast truck or knowledge of back roads or the reflexes to make a desperate escape. The detective told me there were no reports of missing persons connected to the station, but drug dealers are experts at making people disappear without a trace. I drive past gas stations sometimes now, particularly the older ones in isolated locations, and I wonder what secrets they might hide. Most are exactly what they appear to be: honest businesses providing essential services to travelers. But some, I now know, can be far more dangerous than they appear. The experience has given me a healthy respect for the thin line between order and chaos, between safety and danger. In our comfortable modern world, it is easy to forget that predators still exist. That evil is not just a concept from movies and books, but a real force that can intrude into our lives without warning. But I have also learned that ordinary people, when pushed to their limits, are capable of extraordinary things. That a construction worker in an old pickup truck can outrun professional criminals when his life depends on it. That courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. I still make that drive to Nevada regularly for work, but I take the interstate now, stopping only at well-lit truck stops with plenty of other travelers around. The back roads hold too many memories, too many shadows where danger might be waiting. Some lessons, once learned, change how you see the world forever. And sometimes, on those long, straight stretches of highway with the sun setting behind me and the road stretching endlessly ahead, I remember that night and whisper a prayer of gratitude to whatever force watches over fools and travelers. Because sometimes, being lucky is the only thing that stands between us and the darkness that waits just beyond the glow of our headlights. The decision to escape civilization came after 3 months of relentless deadlines and the suffocating buzz of constant notifications. I packed my truck on a Friday evening in late September 2024, determined to find absolute solitude somewhere in the remote valleys of the Cascade foothills. At 32, I had spent too many years glued to screens, and my body craved the kind of silence that only exists miles from any cell tower. The drive took longer than anticipated. Winding mountain roads stretched endlessly before me, each turn revealing another identical ridge of Douglas firs. By 4 in the afternoon, I realized I had miscalculated both the distance and the rapidly shortening daylight hours. The sun hung lower than expected, casting long shadows that seemed to reach across the asphalt like grasping fingers. My truck's engine labored up the steepest grades, and I found myself checking the fuel gauge with increasing frequency. The radio had died to static hours ago, leaving only the sound of tires on pavement and the occasional creak of the vehicle's frame as it navigated the rough patches. I passed the last gas station 30 miles back, a weathered building with pumps that looked like they belonged in another decade. The temperature dropped noticeably as I gained elevation. Through the windshield, I watched patches of early frost glisten on the roadside vegetation. The air smelled different up here, cleaner but somehow thinner, carrying scents of pine sap and decomposing leaves. I cracked the window slightly, letting the mountain air fill the cab, but the chill made me roll it back up within minutes. As the afternoon wore on, I began to question the wisdom of venturing so deep into unfamiliar territory without a concrete camping plan. The original idea had been to find the established campground, but every sign I passed pointed to facilities that were closed for the season or required reservations I had not made. The nearest town was now 40 miles behind me, and turning back would mean driving these treacherous curves in complete darkness. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I navigated another hairpin turn. The road seemed to narrow with each mile, and I had not seen another vehicle for over an hour. The isolation I had craved was becoming more absolute than I had bargained for, and a growing knot of unease settled in my stomach. The sun was painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson when I encountered another human being for the first time in hours. I had pulled over at a scenic overlook to check my map and consider my dwindling options when footsteps on gravel announced his approach. He emerged from the tree line as if he had been waiting there, a man perhaps in his 50s with weathered skin and clothes that suggested he spent considerable time outdoors. His greeting was friendly enough, asking if I was looking for a place to spend the night. When I explained my predicament, he nodded knowingly and pointed toward a barely visible trail that disappeared into the dense forest below us. He described a hidden camping spot near a river, accessible by vehicle but invisible to casual passers-by. The way he spoke about it, with an almost proprietary familiarity, suggested he had used this location many times before. Something in his demeanor struck me as odd, though I could not articulate exactly what troubled me. Perhaps it was the way his eyes never quite met mine, or how he seemed to know immediately that I was alone and unprepared. He offered to show me the way, and despite a nagging sense of caution, I agreed. The alternative was spending the night in my truck beside the main road, and his knowledge of the area seemed genuine. The man climbed into his own vehicle, an ancient pickup truck that started with a grinding protest, and motioned for me to follow. We descended a dirt road that I would never have noticed on my own. So well was it concealed by overhanging branches and strategic placement of fallen logs. The path twisted through dense undergrowth that scraped against my truck's sides, leaving scratches I would discover later. As we drove deeper into the forest, the canopy overhead thickened until only fragments of sky remained visible. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees and moisture began to condense on my windshield. I had to turn on my headlights despite the early hour, their beams illuminating a tunnel of vegetation that seemed to close behind us as we passed. My guide's taillights provided the only reference points in the growing gloom. Several times I lost sight of them around sharp bends, panic rising in my throat until they reappeared ahead. The road descended steadily, and I could hear the sound of rushing water growing louder through the trees. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 20 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing beside a fast-moving stream. The camping spot was indeed hidden, tucked away behind a screen of willows and wild blackberry bushes. Someone had built a fire ring from river stones, and the ground showed evidence of previous campers. My guide pointed out the best spot to park, mentioned that I would likely have complete privacy, and departed as abruptly as he had appeared, his truck disappearing back up the overgrown trail. Alone in the clearing, I took stock of my surroundings as the last daylight faded from the sky. The river ran perhaps 50 feet from where I planned to park, its constant murmur masking other sounds that might have reached my ears. The fire ring sat in the center of the clearing, surrounded by smooth stones that gleamed wetly in my headlight beams. Evidence of previous campers was everywhere. flattened areas where tents had been pitched, beer bottles buried in the soft earth, and char marks on nearby trees. The isolation was more complete than I had anticipated. Standing beside my truck, I could not see any trace of the road we had followed, and the forest seemed to press in from all sides like a living wall. The trees were massive here, old-growth firs and cedars that towered overhead and blocked out most of the night sky. Their branches creaked in the wind with sounds like old houses settling, and occasionally something would crash through the underbrush in the distance. I set about making camp with methodical efficiency, partly to stay warm and partly to quiet the growing unease in my mind. Building a fire became my first priority, both for warmth and for the psychological comfort of light. The kindling caught easily, and soon flames were dancing in the stone circle, casting flickering shadows that made the surrounding trees seem to sway and move. The warmth felt good against my face, but it also created a sphere of light that made everything beyond its reach appear darker by contrast. I arranged a camp chair beside the fire and opened a beer, trying to recapture the sense of peaceful solitude I had sought. The alcohol helped calm my nerves, but it also made me acutely aware of every sound from the darkness beyond my small circle of light. Without cell phone service, I had brought a portable speaker and downloaded several comedy podcasts to keep me company. The familiar voices and laughter helped fill the oppressive silence, though I kept the volume lower than I would have at home. Something about broadcasting my presence into the surrounding forest felt wrong, like sending an invitation to whatever might be listening in the darkness. As the fire burned down to glowing coals, I faced the decision of whether to set up my tent or sleep in the truck. The idea of wrestling with tent poles and stakes in the dark, surrounded by unknown terrain, seemed more daunting than it had in daylight. The truck bed, with its camper shell, offered immediate shelter and the psychological security of metal walls and locking doors. I arranged my sleeping bag and gear in the truck bed, creating a makeshift bedroom that was cramped but serviceable. Through the camper shell's windows, I could see the dying fire and the edge of the forest beyond. The glass felt thin and fragile, but it was better than canvas, and I told myself that any large animal would make enough noise to wake me before it got too close. The night sounds began shortly after I settled into my sleeping bag. What had seemed like peaceful forest ambience during the day transformed into something far more unsettling in complete darkness. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, every splash from the nearby river seemed amplified and potentially threatening. The comedy podcast continued playing softly, but the laughter began to feel inappropriate and intrusive in the wilderness setting. Through the truck's windows, I could see the fire's orange glow gradually dimming to deep red coals. The circle of light it provided grew smaller with each passing hour, and the darkness beyond seemed to press closer. Several times I thought I saw movement at the edge of the light, but when I focused on the spot, nothing was there. My imagination began to populate the shadows with threats that logic told me were unlikely, but fear insisted might be real. The sleeping bag was warm enough, but the truck bed was unforgiving against my spine and shoulders. Every time I shifted position, the metal floor transmitted the sound through the vehicle's frame, making me acutely aware of how much noise I was generating. The podcast helped mask some of the external sounds, but it also prevented me from hearing what might be approaching from outside. Around midnight, something large moved through the brush on the far side of the clearing. The sound was deliberate and sustained, not the quick scurrying of a small animal, but the steady progress of something substantial. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath and straining to listen over the podcast's audio. The movement seemed to circle the camp at a distance, never coming close enough to the dying fire for me to see what was causing it. My hand found the bear spray I had placed beside my sleeping bag, and I gripped it tightly while trying to convince myself that whatever was out there was probably just a deer or elk coming to drink from the river. The rational part of my mind knew that most large animals would avoid a human camp, especially one with the lingering scent of fire and food. But the primitive part of my brain, the part evolved from prey animals, screamed warnings that I could not entirely dismiss. The sounds eventually faded, but they left me wide awake and hypersensitive to every whisper of wind through the trees. I found myself holding my breath for long periods, listening for the return of footsteps or the snap of branches that might indicate something was still nearby. The podcast became an annoyance rather than a comfort. its cheerful banter a jarring contrast to my growing anxiety. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of being watched and stalked. In one particularly vivid nightmare, I was lying in the truck bed while something pressed its face against the windows, breathing heavily and leaving condensation on the glass. I woke with a start, heart hammering, and immediately checked all the windows for signs of the dream intruder. Finding nothing, I told myself it was just anxiety manifesting in my subconscious. But the feeling of being observed persisted until dawn. The first light of morning brought a false sense of security that lasted exactly as long as it took me to climb out of the truck and survey my surroundings. The fire had died completely, leaving only cold ashes and blackened stones. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening but somehow more alien, as if I were seeing it clearly for the first time. Moisture hung in the air, creating a thin mist that made distant objects appear to shimmer and shift. I set about rekindling the fire, more for the comfort of the ritual than for warmth. The morning was crisp but not uncomfortable, and I looked forward to a hot breakfast and coffee before beginning the journey home. The plan was simple: eat, pack up, and leave this place with its unsettling atmosphere behind me. I had gotten the solitude I sought, perhaps more than I had bargained for, and now I craved the safety and predictability of civilization. The kindling caught easily, and soon flames were dancing again in the stone circle. I arranged my camping chair beside the fire and began preparing a simple meal of instant oatmeal and coffee. The familiar routine helped calm my nerves, and I began to feel foolish about the previous night's anxiety. Daylight had a way of making nighttime fears seem overblown and irrational. It was while I was stirring the oatmeal that I first noticed the figure at the edge of the clearing. He stood just inside the tree line, perhaps 30 yards away, partially obscured by the morning mist and the shadows of the forest. At first glance, I thought he might be another camper who had emerged from a tent I had somehow missed in the darkness. But as my eyes adjusted and focused, the details became increasingly disturbing. The man was tall and gaunt, dressed in layers of clothing that appeared to have been accumulated over months or years without laundering. But it was not his disheveled appearance that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was the hundreds of plastic bags tied to his body like grotesque ornaments. Grocery bags, shopping bags, trash bags, all knotted around his arms, legs, and torso until he resembled some nightmarish scarecrow that had wandered away from its post. The bags moved constantly in the slight breeze, creating a soft, rustling sound that was barely audible over the river's murmur, but somehow carried clearly across the clearing. They were tied with such precision and abundance that his human form was almost completely obscured, creating a silhouette that belonged in a fever dream rather than a peaceful morning campsite. He stood perfectly still, facing in my general direction but not looking directly at me. His posture suggested awareness of my presence, but there was something fundamentally wrong about his behavior. No greeting, no acknowledgement, no explanation for his bizarre appearance or his presence in this remote location. He simply stood there like a monument to madness, the plastic bags whispering their secrets to the morning air. My appetite vanished instantly, replaced by a cold dread that settled in my stomach like a stone. Every instinct screamed that this encounter was not going to end with a friendly exchange of camping stories. The man's very presence felt like a violation of the natural order, as if something that should have remained hidden in the deepest parts of the forest had chosen to reveal itself in the growing daylight. Minutes passed in tense silence as we regarded each other across the clearing. I remained seated beside my fire, spoon halfway to my mouth with cooling oatmeal, while he maintained his motionless vigil at the forest's edge. The plastic bags continued their constant rustling, a sound that began to feel like whispered threats in a language I could not understand, but somehow knew was malevolent. My mind raced through possible explanations for his appearance and behavior. Perhaps he was mentally ill, a homeless individual who had wandered into the wilderness and constructed this bizarre costume from discarded materials. Maybe he was under the influence of drugs that had distorted his perception of reality, or possibly he was playing some elaborate prank, though the remoteness of the location made that seem unlikely. None of these rational explanations adequately addressed the pure wrongness of his presence. There was something fundamentally disturbing about the way he held himself, the deliberate positioning of his body, and the calculated nature of his stillness. This was not random behavior or the actions of someone who was simply lost or confused. This felt purposeful and predatory. I forced myself to take a sip of coffee, trying to project an air of calm I did not feel. The hot liquid burned my tongue, but the pain helped focus my attention and prevent panic from overwhelming my judgment. I needed to handle this situation carefully, without escalating whatever was happening into something more dangerous. "Good morning," I called out, keeping my voice steady and friendly despite the fear that was coursing through my system. "Beautiful day for camping, isn't it?" No response. He remained frozen in place, though I thought I detected a slight tilting of his head, as if he were listening to something I could not hear. The bags rustled more vigorously for a moment, then settled back into their previous rhythm. I tried a different approach. "Are you hungry? I've got plenty of food if you'd like to join me for breakfast." Again, no verbal response, but this time he shifted his weight slightly, causing the entire collection of bags to sway and dance. The movement was hypnotic and deeply unsettling, like watching seaweed move in underwater currents. I found myself staring at the constantly shifting patterns, trying to discern the human form beneath the plastic camouflage. The silence stretched between us, growing more oppressive with each passing second. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel sweat beginning to form on my palms despite the cool morning air. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming warnings, telling me to run, to fight, to do anything except continue this surreal standoff. "Look," I said, standing up slowly and keeping my hands visible. "I don't know what you want, but I'm just here camping. I'm not looking for any trouble." For the first time he moved. Not toward me or away, but in a slow, deliberate circle around the perimeter of the clearing. His movements were fluid and purposeful, like a predator testing the boundaries of its territory. The bags created a constant susurration that seemed to grow louder as he moved, until it became the dominant sound in the morning air. My hand moved instinctively to the bear spray clipped to my belt. The weight of it was reassuring, but I knew that using it would escalate the situation beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. Still, the presence of some form of defense helped keep the rising panic at bay. The stranger's circling behavior continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. He moved with the patience of something that had no concept of time, no urgent need to be anywhere else or do anything else. His entire existence seemed focused on this moment, this place, and whatever purpose had brought him to my campsite on this particular morning. I tried one more time to establish communication, calling out an offer of coffee or food, but my voice sounded thin and desperate in the morning air. The lack of any human response was perhaps more terrifying than an aggressive action would have been. At least aggression was a behavior I could understand and react to. This calculated indifference was completely outside my experience. My fear finally crystallized into anger, a hot surge of emotion that cut through the paralysis of uncertainty. I was tired of being toyed with, tired of feeling like prey being evaluated by a predator. If he wanted confrontation, I would give it to him on my terms. "Acknowledge me or get out," I shouted, my voice cracking with a mixture of fear and rage. "I'm not playing whatever game this is." I pulled the bear spray from my belt and held it up where he could see it clearly, hoping the threat of pain would break through whatever mental fog was driving his behavior. The canister felt solid and purposeful in my hand, a tangible reminder that I was not completely helpless in this situation. The effect was immediate and dramatic. He stopped his circling motion and turned to face me directly for the first time since his appearance. Even with the bags obscuring his features, I could sense his attention focusing on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the clearing, predator and prey locked in a moment of mutual recognition. Then, without warning or explanation, he turned and walked back into the forest with the same deliberate pace he had maintained throughout the encounter. The bags rustled and whispered as he moved, the sound gradually fading as the trees swallowed his bizarre silhouette. Within seconds, he had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. I stood frozen beside my dying fire, bear spray still raised, waiting for him to reappear or for some other shoe to drop. The morning sounds of the forest gradually returned. Bird calls, wind through the trees, the constant murmur of the river. But underneath these normal sounds, I imagined I could still hear the whisper of plastic bags moving through the underbrush. The spell broke suddenly, and I snapped into frantic action. Breakfast forgotten, fire abandoned. I began throwing my gear into the truck with desperate efficiency. Every second he was out of sight was a second he could be positioning himself for another approach, possibly from a direction where I would not see him coming. The truck started on the first try, and I had never been more grateful for the sound of an internal combustion engine. I reversed quickly from the camping spot, tires spinning on the soft ground, and headed up the overgrown trail that had brought me to this nightmare location. Branches scraped against the truck's sides, but I did not slow down until I reached the main road. The drive back to civilization was a blur of adrenaline and relief. I did not stop until I reached the first town with cell phone service, where I sat in a McDonald's parking lot for an hour, trying to process what had happened in that hidden valley. The normalcy of suburban life, with its traffic lights and chain restaurants and ordinary people going about their daily routines, felt like a different universe from the one I had just escaped. Part of me wanted to report the incident to local authorities, but what would I tell them? That I had encountered a man covered in plastic bags who had stood still and watched me eat breakfast. No crime had been committed, no direct threat had been made. By any objective measure, nothing had actually happened except an unusual encounter in the wilderness. But I knew that something significant had occurred in that clearing, something that challenged my understanding of normal human behavior and the safety of solitude. The memory of those rustling bags and that calculating stillness would not fade, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that place. In the weeks that followed, I found myself researching missing persons cases in the area, looking for reports of other campers who might have encountered the same individual. I scoured online forums and social media groups dedicated to outdoor activities, searching for stories that might corroborate my experience. I found nothing concrete, but there were enough vague references to strange encounters and weird people in the woods to convince me that I was not the only one who had stumbled into something unsettling. The experience changed my relationship with solitude and wilderness camping. The peace and restoration I had sought in that remote valley had been replaced by a constant awareness of vulnerability and the thin veneer of civilization that protects us from the truly aberrant elements of human society. Every camping trip since has been to established campgrounds with other people nearby, and I no longer venture into truly remote areas alone. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I wonder about the stranger with the plastic bags. Was he a local character, well known to residents but invisible to casual visitors? Was he dangerous or simply eccentric in a way that triggered primal fears? Had he been camping in that valley for days or weeks before my arrival, watching other visitors with the same unsettling intensity? The questions multiply without answers, but one certainty remains. I was wise to trust my instincts and leave when I did. Whatever his intentions might have been, whatever purpose drove him to adorn himself with those whispering plastic ornaments and lurk in the forest shadows, I did not want to discover it through direct experience. The memory serves as a reminder that true wilderness contains more than just natural dangers. Sometimes the most frightening predators are the ones that walk upright and should know better, the ones that have abandoned the social contracts that allow civilization to function. In seeking to escape the pressures of modern life, I had stumbled into something far more primitive and threatening. I still seek solitude in nature, but I do so with greater wisdom and preparation now. The mountains and forests offer restoration and peace, but they also harbor secrets that are better left undisturbed. Some valleys should remain hidden, some clearings should stay empty, and some encounters should never happen at all. The plastic bags still rustle in my nightmares, and I suspect they always will.